Sharpe's Prey.
Disc 4.
Sharpe reached the city as evening was falling. The wagon creaked through a district of lavish houses, each standing in its own wide garden, then skirted the end of what looked like a wide canal that protected the city's walls. A causeway led over a smaller moat to one of the city's gates, this one a massive pair of metal-studded doors set in a wide tunnel that led through the layered ramparts. The hay wains stopped among a group of other carts and more elegant carriages. Voices sounded close. Sharpe suspected soldiers were searching all the traffic, but if so, they were content merely to ask the driver some questions. None bothered to clamber up the wagon's high sides, and after a while the driver clicked his tongue. The horses took the wagon's weight, and the vehicle lurched on through the long, dark tunnel to emerge into the heart of the city. Sharpe, bedded down in the hay, could only see gables, roofs and spires. The sun was low in the west, gleaming on red tiles and green copper. The evening wind billowed a white curtain from a high window. He smelt coffee. Then an organ sounded from a church, filling the air with great chords. Sharpe pulled on his greatcoat, took hold of his pack, and waited until the wagon turned into a narrower street. Then he climbed over the wooden trellis at the vehicle's rear and dropped down to the cobbles. A girl watched him from a doorway as he tried to rid himself of the wisps of hay that smothered his clothes. A woman, leading a child by the hand, crossed the narrow street rather than go close by him, and Sharpe, looking down at his muddied trousers, was not surprised. He looked like a tramp, but a tramp with a sabre. It was time to find Lord Pumphrey's man, so Sharpe buttoned his greatcoat and walked towards the wider street. It was almost dark, but it looked a prosperous city. Shopkeepers were shuttering their premises, while yellow lamplights spilled from hundreds of windows. A giant wooden pipe hung above a tobacco shop. Laughter and the clink of glasses came from a tavern. A crippled sailor, his pigtail thick with tar, swung on crutches down the pavement. Big carriages rolled briskly down a wide street where small boys swept the horse dung towards wooden holding boxes. It was like London, but not like London. Much cleaner for a start. Sharpe gaped at a soaring spire that was formed by the entwined tails of 4 copper dragons. He also saw, more usefully, that every street and alley was clearly marked with a name. That was not like London, where a visitor found his way by guesswork and by God. An elderly man, bearded and carrying a bundle of books wrapped in string, saw Sharpe gaping up at the street name. He said something in Danish, and Sharpe just shrugged. "Vous êtes français?" the man asked. "American," Sharpe said. It did not seem wise to admit to being English at a time when a British fleet and army was sailing to assault Denmark. "American!" The old man seemed delighted. "You are lost, perhaps?" "I am." "You seek a hostel, yes?" "I'm looking for a place called... what the hell was it? Elfinsplatz?" he guessed. "A man called Ollie Stovgard." He knew he had got the names wrong and sorted through his pockets for Lord Pumphrey's scrap of paper. "Ulfedsplatz," Sharpe read the unfamiliar name awkwardly. 2 or 3 other passers-by had stopped now, for it seemed that if someone was lost in Copenhagen, then the citizens regarded it as their duty to offer help. "Ah, Ulfedsplatz. It is a short walk," the old man said. "But everything in Copenhagen is a short walk. We are not like Paris or London. Have you been to those cities?" "No." "Washington, now, is that big?" "Pretty big," Sharpe said, who had no idea. "Do all men carry swords in America?" The old man, not content with directing him to Ulfedsplatz, was now walking with him. "Most of us," Sharpe said. "We have lost the habit in Denmark," the old man said, "except for the soldiers, of course, and a handful of our aristocracy who think it is a badge of rank." He chuckled, then sighed. "I fear, alas, we shall all have to wear swords soon." "You will? Why?" "We are warned that the British are coming again. I pray it isn't so, for I remember the last time when their Lord Nelson came, 6 years ago. I had a son on the Dannebrogge, and he lost a leg." "I'm sorry," Sharpe said awkwardly. He vaguely remembered hearing about Nelson's attack on Copenhagen, but it had happened when he was in India, and the news had not provoked much interest in the regiment. "It turned out for the best," the old man went on. "Edvard is a minister now, in Randers. It is safer, I think, being a minister than a naval officer. There are Lutherans in America?" "Oh, yes," Sharpe said, having no idea what a Lutheran was. "I am glad to hear it," the old man said. He had led Sharpe down a narrow street that emerged into a small square. "This is Ulfedsplatz." He gestured to the square. "You will be all right now?" he asked anxiously. Sharpe reassured and thanked the old man, then fished out the scrap of paper and read the name in the fading light. Ollie Skovgaard. One side of the square was occupied by a gin distillery, another by a huge warehouse, and between them were small shops, a cooperage, a wheelwright's, and a cutlery store. He walked along the shops, looking for Skovgaard's name, then saw it painted in faded white letters high on the big warehouse wall. The warehouse had a high archway, and next to it a smaller door with a polished brass knocker. The smaller door belonged to a house that was evidently attached to the warehouse, for the S of the Skovgaard sign was painted on its bricks. Sharpe rapped the knocker. He was nervous. Lord Pumphrey had made it plain that Skovgaard was a last resort, but Sharpe did not know where else he could seek help. He knocked again, heard a window being thrown up, and stepped back to see a face peering down in the gloom. "Mr. Skovgaard," he called. "Oh, no," the man said unhelpfully. "Are you Mr. Skovgaard?" Sharpe asked. There was a pause. "You are English?" the man asked cautiously. "I need to see Mr. Skovgaard." "It is too late," the man said disapprovingly, ignoring the lingering light in the summer sky. Sharpe swore under his breath. "Is Mr. Skovgaard there?" "You will wait there, please." The window slammed down. There were footsteps on the stairs, and a moment later the door was laboriously unbolted and unlocked. It opened to reveal a tall and lugubrious young man with long light brown hair and a palely anxious face. "You are English?" the man asked. "Are you Ollie Skovgaard?" "Oh, no, no," the young man frowned. "I am Axel Bang. I am Mr. Skovgaard's overseer. Is that the word? I dwell here now. Mr. Skovgaard has moved to Vesterfeld." "Where's that?" Sharpe asked. "Vesterfeld is not far. It is not far. It is where the city is growing." Bang frowned at the mud and hay on Sharpe's clothes. "You are English?" "My name's Sharpe. Richard Sharpe." Bang ignored the introduction. "Mr. Skovgaard insists the English are taken to him. It is his rule, you understand? I need a coat, and then I shall take you to Vesterfeld. You will tarry here, please?" He vanished down the hallway and returned a moment later with a coat and a wide-brimmed hat. "Mr. Skovgard did dwell here," he explained as he shut and carefully locked the door, "but he has bought a house outside the city. He went from this place a month ago. Not so long, I think, but Westerfeld is not so far. It is where the new houses are. Not 5 years ago it was all meadow. Now it is houses. You have just come to Copenhagen, perhaps?" "Yes." "My English is not so good," Bang said, "but I practice. You know how I practice? By reading the scripture in English. That is good, I think. There is an English church here. Did you know that?" "No." "Is there a Danish church in London?" Sharpe confessed ignorance. He was becoming increasingly nervous, for he knew he looked odd. His coat was filthy, and his boots were caked with mud, but it was the sabre that seemed to attract most glances of disapproval. So Sharpe hitched the scabbard up into his left armpit, and so hid it under his coat. He had just done that when a man lurched from an alley and startled Sharpe by trying to embrace him. Axel Bang hurried Sharpe on. "That man is a bibber of wine," he said disapprovingly. "A drunkard. That is bad." "You've never been drunk?" "I abhor liquor. It is the devil's drink. I have never touched a drop, and with God's help I never will. Never. We have not so many drunkards in Copenhagen, but there are some." He looked at Sharpe earnestly. "I trust you are born again into Jesus Christ?" "I trust so too," Sharpe growled, hoping that answer would deter Bang. Sharpe did not much care about his own soul at that moment. He was far more worried by the city gate that lay just ahead of them. He brushed hay off his coat and hitched the sabre up again. The gate was inside the long tunnel that led through the thick walls, and it was wide open, but there were men in blue uniforms standing in the light of 2 great lanterns, suspended from the tunnel's roof. Were they searching for Sharpe? It seemed likely, but Sharpe hoped they were only investigating the incoming traffic. "God so loved the world," Axel Bang said, "that he sent his only son. You have surely heard that piece of scripture?" The tunnel was very close now. A uniformed man with a bushy moustache and a shouldered musket came from the guardhouse, glanced at Bang and Sharpe, then struck flint on steel to light a pipe. He sucked on the flame, and his eyes, reflecting the small fire, stared hard at Sharpe. "How do you say that verse in Danish?" Sharpe asked Bang. "Tisseløs skuld verden, at hin gav sin son den enbårne," Axel Bang recited happily. "For at verden, som tror på ham, ikke skal fortabes, men have et evigt liv." Sharpe tried not to look at the moustached guard, hoping that the sound of Danish would mislead the sentries. The sabre scabbard was high at his side, awkwardly trapped beneath his coat by his left elbow. He kept his head down, pretending to be paying close attention to Bang's fervent words. Their footsteps echoed under the arch. Sharpe smelt the tobacco as he walked past the guard. He felt conspicuous, sure that one of the men would reach out and take his elbow, but none seemed to find him suspicious, and suddenly he and Axel Bang were out of the gate tunnel and crossing a wide-open area that lay between the walls and the canal-like lakes that protected the city's landward ramparts. Sharpe sighed with relief. "Beautiful words," Bang said happily. "Indeed," Sharpe said, his relief making him sound fervent. Bang finally abandoned Sharpe's soul. "You have met Mr. Skovgard before?" he asked. "No." They were on a causeway that crossed the canal, and Sharpe at last was feeling safe. "I ask because it is rumoured that England is sending an army to take our fleet. Is that true, do you think?" "I don't know." Bang glanced at the sabre scabbard that Sharpe had let drop, now that they were out of the city and in the less populated suburbs. "I think you are a soldier, perhaps," Bang said. "I was," Sharpe said curtly. "The buttons on your coat, yes? And the sword? I wanted to be a soldier, but my father believed I should learn business, and Mr. Skovgard is a very able teacher. I am lucky, I think. He is a good man." "And rich?" Sharpe asked sourly. They had left the road to walk through a cemetery, but beyond the graveyard's low wall he could see big houses standing in tree-shaded gardens. "He is wealthy, yes," Bang said, "but in matters of the spirit he is poor. His son died, as did his wife, God bless their souls, as did his daughter's husband and her son. 4 deaths in 3 years. Now all that is left is Mr. Skovgard and Astrid." Something in Bang's voice made Sharpe glance at him. So that was how the land lay. Skovgard had a daughter and no son, which meant the daughter would inherit. "And the daughter?" Sharpe asked. "She hasn't married again?" "Not yet," Bang said, with studied carelessness. Then he unlatched the cemetery gate and waved Sharpe through. They walked up a street edged with trees until they reached a white-painted gate beyond which lay one of the big houses. Its bricks and red roof tiles were hardly discoloured, suggesting the house was only a year or 2 old. Back in the city, a church clock struck 8:30. The sound echoed by other church bells in the suburbs as Bang led Sharpe up the long carriage drive. An elderly servant, soberly dressed in a brown suit with silver buttons, opened the door. He did not seem surprised to see Axel Bang, though he frowned at the mud and hay on Sharpe's coat. Bang spoke in Danish to the servant, who bowed and left. "You will tarry here, please," Bang told Sharpe, "and I shall tell Mr. Skovgard of your coming." Bang disappeared down a short panelled corridor, while Sharpe looked around the tiled hall. A crystal chandelier hung above him, an Eastern rug was underfoot, and from one of the closed doors came the sound of tinkling music. A spinet or harpsichord, Sharpe was not sure which. He took off his hat and caught sight of himself in a gilt-framed looking-glass that hung above a spindly table on which a china bowl held a pile of visiting cards. He grimaced at his reflection, picked some more hay off his coat and tried to smooth his hair. The music had stopped, and Sharpe, still staring at the mirror, saw the door behind him open. He turned, and for the first time since Grace had died, he felt his heart leap. A girl dressed all in black stood looking at him with an expression of astonished delight. She was tall, very fair-haired and blue-eyed. Later, much later, Sharpe would notice she had a wide forehead, a generous mouth, a long straight nose and a quick laugh, but at the moment he just stared at her, and she stared back, and the welcoming look of pleasure on her face died, to be replaced by a puzzled sadness. She said something in Danish. "I'm sorry," Sharpe said. "You are English?" she asked, sounding surprised. "Yes, miss." She stared at him oddly, then shook her head. "You look so like someone else." She paused. "Someone I knew." There were tears in her eyes. "I am Skovgard's daughter," she introduced herself. "Astrid." "Richard Sharpe, miss," he said. "You speak good English." "My mother was English." She glanced down the corridor. "You are here to see my father?" "I hope so." "Then I am sorry to have disturbed you," she said. "You were playing?" Sharpe asked. "I am not good." She offered him a quick and embarrassed smile. "I have to practice." She gave him a last puzzled look. then went back into the room. She left the door ajar, and after a moment a few solitary notes sounded again. 2 men came to fetch Sharpe. Like the servant who had answered the door, they were both dressed in brown, but these men were much younger. They also looked fit and hard. One jerked his head, and Sharpe obediently followed them down the short passage. The door at the end squeaked alarmingly, but opened into an elegant room, where Axel Bang was standing beside a thin man who was sitting at a desk, his head bowed. Sharpe dropped his pack, coat and hat on a chair and waited. The door squealed shut behind him. Then the 2 young men, evidently guards, stood not far behind him. The room was a study, but large enough to hold a small dance. Bookcases filled with forbidding leather volumes lined 2 walls. The third had tall glass doors opening onto a garden, while the fourth was panelled in a pale wood that surrounded a carved marble hearth, above which hung a portrait of a gloomy man dressed in preacher's black with Geneva bands. Then the man behind the desk laid down his pen, unhooked a pair of spectacles from his ears, and looked up at Sharpe. He blinked with apparent astonishment when he saw his visitor's face, but hid whatever surprised him. "I am Ollie Skovgaard," he said in a gravelly voice, "and Axel has forgotten your name." "Lieutenant Richard Sharpe, sir." "An Englishman," Skovgaard said disapprovingly. "An Englishman," he said again. "Yet you look just like my poor son-in-law. God rest his soul. You did not meet Nils, did you, Axel?" "I did not enjoy that privilege, sir," Bang said, bobbing his head with pleasure at being addressed by his employer. "He looked exactly like that Englishman," Skovgaard said. "The resemblance is, what is the word, extraordinary." He shook his head in wonderment. He had sunken cheeks, a tall forehead, and an expression of severe disapproval. He looked to be in his 50s, though his fair hair had no grey yet. "Do you spell your name with an E?" he asked, and when Sharpe confirmed the spelling, hooked the spectacles over his ears and made a note with a scratching quill. "And you are a lieutenant, yes? In the Navy or the Army? And what regiment?" His English was perfect. He wrote down Sharpe's answers, blew on the wet ink, then toyed with an ivory letter opener as he looked Sharpe up and down. After a while he gave a small shrug, then turned to Bang. "Perhaps, Axel, you would wait in the parlour with Miss Astrid." Of course." Bang looked absurdly pleased as he hurried from the room. "Tell me, Lieutenant Sharpe," Skovgaard said, "what brings you to my house?" "I was told you'd help me, sir." "By whom?" "By Lord Pumphrey, sir." "I have never heard of Lord Pumphrey," Skovgaard said bleakly. He stood and crossed to a side table. He was dressed all in black and had a black crepe mourning band about his right sleeve. He was so thin he looked like a skeleton walking. He selected a pipe from a rack, filled it with tobacco from a jar that had a painted dragon circling its belly, then carried a silver tinderbox back to his desk. He struck the charred linen alight, transferred the flame to a spill, and lit the pipe. He waited till the tobacco was burning evenly. "Why would this Lord Pumphrey believe I would help you?" "He said you were a friend of Britain, sir." "Did he now? Did he?" Skovgaard sucked on the pipe. The smoke curled to a ceiling that was lavishly moulded in plaster. "I am a merchant, Lieutenant Sharpe," he said, somehow making the rank sound like an insult. "I deal in sugar, tobacco, jute, coffee, and indigo. All those items, Lieutenant, must be carried here in ships. That would suggest, would it not, that I am in favour of the Royal Navy, for it helps our own navy protect the sea lanes. Does that make me a friend of Britain?" Sharpe looked into the merchant's eyes. They were pale, unfriendly, and unsettling. "I was told so, sir," he said awkwardly. "Yet Britain, Lieutenant Sharpe, has sent a fleet to the Baltic, ships of the line, frigates, bombships, gunships, and over 200 transports. Enough, I think, to convey 20,000 men. That fleet passed the score last night. Where do you think it is going?" "I don't know, sir," Sharpe said. "Russia? I think not. The little Swedish garrison at Stralsund, perhaps? But France can take Stralsund whenever she pleases, and throwing more men into its walls merely dooms them. Sweden? Why would Britain send an army to its friends in Sweden? I think that fleet is coming here, Lieutenant Sharpe, here, to Copenhagen. Do you think that is an unreasonable assumption?" "I don't know, sir," Sharpe said feebly. "You don't know?" There was acid in Skovgard's voice now. He stood again, agitated. "Where else can such a fleet be going?" He paced up and down in front of the empty hearth, trailing tobacco smoke. "Earlier this month, Lieutenant, a peace treaty was signed between France and Russia. The Tsar and Napoleon met at Tilsit, and between them they divided Europe. Do you know this?" "No, sir." "Then I shall educate you, Lieutenant. France and Russia are now friends, while Prussia is reduced to a husk. Napoleon commands Europe, Lieutenant, and we all live under his shadow. Yet he lacks one thing, a fleet. Without a fleet he cannot defeat Britain, and there is only one fleet left in Europe that can challenge the Royal Navy." "The Danish fleet," Sharpe said. "You are not so ignorant as you pretend, eh?" Skovgard paused to relight the pipe. "There was a secret article in the Treaty of Tilsit, Lieutenant, by which Russia agreed to allow France to take the Danish fleet. That fleet is not Russia's to give, nor France's to take, but such niceties will not stop Napoleon. He has sent an army to our frontier on the mainland, hoping that we will surrender the fleet rather than fight. But we shall not surrender, Lieutenant, we shall not." He spoke passionately, but Sharpe heard the hopelessness in his voice. How could little Denmark resist France? "So why," Skovgard went on, "does Britain send ships and men to the Baltic?" "To take the fleet, sir," Sharpe admitted, and he wondered how Skovgard had learned of a secret article in a treaty signed by France and Russia. But then, if Lord Pumphrey was right, that was Skovgard's business when he was not importing tobacco and jute. "We are neutral," Skovgard protested. "But if Britain attacks us, then she will drive us into the arms of France. Is that what Britain wants?" "It wants the fleet out of French reach, sir." "That we can manage without your help," Skovgard said. But not if the French invaded, Sharpe thought, and broke the Danish army. The subsequent peace treaty would demand the surrender of the navy, and thus Napoleon would have his warships. But he said none of that aloud, for Skovgard, he reckoned, knew that truth as well as he did. "So tell me, Lieutenant," Skovgard said, "what brings you to my house?" So Sharpe told his tale. Told of Lavisa, of the chest of gold, of the mission to the Crown Prince, and of his escape from the beach near Koga. Skovgard listened with an expressionless face, then wanted to know more. Who had sent him exactly? When did Sharpe first know of the mission? What were his qualifications? What was his history? He seemed particularly interested that Sharpe had risen from the ranks. Sharpe did not understand why half the questions were even asked, but he answered as best he could, though he resented the Inquisition, which felt uncomfortably like a magistrate's interrogation. Skovgard at last finished his questions, put down his pipe, and took a clean sheet of paper from a desk drawer. He wrote for some time, saying nothing. He finally finished, sanded the ink, folded the paper and dropped a blob of wax to seal it. He then spoke in Danish to one of the two men who still stood behind Sharpe. The door squealed open, and a moment later Axel Bang returned to the room. Skovgard was writing an address above the red sealing wax. "Axel," he spoke in English, presumably so Sharpe would understand, "I know it is late, but would you be so kind as to deliver this note?" Bang took the letter, and an expression of surprise showed on his face when he saw the address. "Of course, sir," he said. "You need not return here," Skovgard said, "unless there is a reply, which I do not expect. I shall see you at the warehouse in the morning?" "Of course, sir," Bang said, and hurried from the room. Skovgard scraped out his exhausted pipe. "Tell me, Lieutenant," he said, "why you, an army officer of no special distinction, are here. The British government, I assume, employs men to fight the war of secrets. Such men will speak the languages of Europe and have the skills of subterfuge. Yet they sent you. Why?" "The Duke of York wanted someone to protect Captain Lavisser, sir." Skovgard frowned. "Captain Lavisser is a soldier, is he not?" "He is also grandson to the Count of Vigard. I would hardly think such a man needs your protection in Denmark, or anywhere else for that matter." "There was more to it than that, sir." Sharpe frowned, knowing he was doing a bad job of explaining himself. "Lord Pumphrey didn't really trust Captain Lavisser, sir." "They don't trust him, so they sent him here with gold?" Skovgard was icily amused. "The Duke of York insisted," Sharpe said lamely. Skovgard stared at Sharpe for a few seconds. "If I might summarize your position, Lieutenant, you are telling me, are you not, that Captain Lavisser has come to Denmark under false pretenses?" "Yes, sir." "You're quite right, Lieutenant," Skovgard said. "You are so very right." He spoke with force and an evident dislike of Sharpe. "The Honourable John Lavisser, Lieutenant, arrived in Copenhagen yesterday and presented himself to His Majesty the Crown Prince. That audience is described in this morning's Berlinske Tidende." He lifted a newspaper from his desk, unfolded it and tapped a column of print. "The paper tells us that Lavisser came to fight for Denmark because in all conscience he cannot support England. His reward, Lieutenant, is a major's commission in the Finn Light Dragoons and an appointment as an aide-de-camp to General Ernst Peymann. Lavisser is a patriot, a hero." Skovgard threw down the paper, and a new, bitter anger entered his voice. "And it is contemptible of you to suggest he was sent to bribe the Crown Prince. His Majesty is not corrupt. Indeed, he is our best hope. The Crown Prince will lead our country against all its enemies, whether they be British or French. If we lost the Prince, Lieutenant, then lesser men, timid men, might make an accommodation with those enemies, but the Prince is stalwart, and Major Lavisser, far from coming to corrupt His Majesty, is here to support him." "He brought gold, sir." "That is hardly a crime," Skovgard said sarcastically. "So, what is it, Lieutenant, that you want me to do?" "My orders, sir, were to take Captain Lavisser and the gold back to the British Army if the Prince refused the bribe, sir." And you come here expecting my help in that endeavour? Yes, sir. Skovgard leaned back in the chair and stared at Sharpe with an expression of distaste. His long fingers toyed with the letter-opener. Then he tossed it on the desk. "It is true, Lieutenant," he said, "that I have at times been of assistance to Great Britain." He waved a hand, as if to suggest that assistance had been trivial, though in truth there were few men in Northern Europe more valuable to London. Skovgard was a Danish patriot, but his marriage to an Englishwoman had given him a fond attachment to a second country that was now sorely tied by the expectation of a British fleet. Skovgard had never intended to involve himself in the murky business of espionage. At first he had merely passed on to the British embassy whatever news he gathered from the skippers of the Baltic traders who came to his warehouse, and over the years that intelligence had grown, until Skovgard was paying the golden coins of St. George to a score of men and women in Northern Europe. London valued him, but Skovgard was no longer sure he wanted to help London, now that a British fleet was fast approaching Copenhagen. "This is a time," he said to Sharpe, "when all Danes must choose their allegiance. That is as true of me as it is of Major Leveson, a man I am not inclined to doubt. He has risen high in your country's service, Lieutenant. He was a Guards officer, an aide to the Duke of York, and a gentleman who, in all conscience, can no longer support what your country is doing. But you, what are you, Lieutenant?" "A soldier, sir," Sharpe said bleakly. "What kind?" The question was caustic. "How old are you? 30? And still a second lieutenant?" "It's where you start that counts," Sharpe said bitterly. "And where will you end?" Skovgard did not wait for an answer, but instead picked up the Berlinske Tidende. "The newspaper, Lieutenant, tells us more than the mere facts of Major Leveson's arrival. Yesterday afternoon, at the invitation of the Crown Prince, Major Leveson addressed the Defence Commission, and I think you should hear his remarks. He warned that Britain is desperate, and that she will stoop to the lowest measures to weaken Denmark's resolve. If it is a matter of cutting off heads, then Britain can do it as well as Madame Guillotine. Are you listening, Lieutenant? These are Major Leveson's words. I have heard, I cannot vouch for its truth, that an army officer whose career is close to an end, a ruffian promoted from the ranks who faces ruin because of scandal at home, has been dispatched to Denmark to assassinate the Crown Prince. I cringe from believing such a thing, but would still encourage every loyal Dane to be watchful." Skovgard threw down the paper. "Well, Lieutenant?" Sharpe stared at him in disbelief. "And what are you, Lieutenant?" Skovgard asked. "An aging lieutenant who started in the ranks, yet you wish me to believe that Britain would send such a man to treat with a prince? You?" He looked Sharpe up and down with utter disgust. "I've told you the truth," Sharpe protested angrily. "I doubt that," Skovgard said, "but it is easy enough to discover. I have sent a note to Major Leveson asking him to come here in the morning to confirm or deny your account." "You invited Leveson here," Sharpe protested. "That bastard tried to kill me." Skovgard stiffened. "I deplore base language," he said. "So, Lieutenant, are you willing to wait here and face Major Leveson?" "Like hell I am," Sharpe said. He turned to fetch his pack and coat. "And damn you, Skovgard," he added. The two men blocked Sharpe from the door, and Skovgard's voice turned him back towards the desk, where the merchant now held a long-barrelled pistol. "I am not willing to risk my prince's life, Lieutenant," Skovgard said. "You will either stay here, of your own accord, or I shall detain you until Major Lavisser can give me advice." Sharpe was just gauging the distance to the desk, and the likelihood that the pistol would be accurate, when one of the two men drew another gun. It was a big one, the kind of pistol that a man would employ to put down a horse, and its great black muzzle was pointed at Sharpe's head. Skovgaard said something in Danish, and the other man, while his companion held the gun steady, took away Sharpe's sabre, then searched his pockets. He found the gold Sharpe had stolen on board the Cleopatra, but Skovgaard sternly ordered him to return it. Then the man discovered Sharpe's small, folding knife, which went into a drawer of Skovgaard's desk. Then, with the pistol still threatening him, Sharpe was pushed into the hall. Astrid, Skovgaard's daughter, watched in astonishment from her doorway, but said nothing. Sharpe was thrust into a small room that opened from the hall. The door was shut, and he heard a key turn in the lock, and the sound reminded him that he had lost his picklock on the beach near Koge. There were no windows in the room, and thus no light, but he groped about to discover he was in a small dining room furnished with a wide table and 6 chairs. It was the kind of room where a small, intimate dinner party could be held, warmed by a great fire that would burn in the now empty hearth. The room was now Sharpe's prison. He was locked in and felt like a bloody fool. Lavisser had anticipated him, trapped him and beaten him. The guardsman was 43,000 guineas richer, and Sharpe had failed. Chapter 5. It was on the wide terrace of Kronborg Castle at Helsingør that the ghost of Hamlet's father had stalked the night, and now, under the quarter moon of another night's sky, a score of big guns faced the narrow sea, their long barrels shadowed in the deep embrasures. Beneath the terrace, in an arched crypt, 2 men pumped the handles of massive bellows to blast cold air into one of the fortress's 3 furnaces. Other men, using long-handled cradles, tongs and pokers, rolled iron shot onto the coals, which in the fire's deep heart glowed white as the air hissed through the bellows' iron nozzles. The furnace, hidden in the crypt so that its light would not glow on the fortress walls at night, was like a glimpse of hell. Red light flickered on the stone arches and glistened on the naked torsos of the men labouring about the roaring, seething incandescence. The first 6 shot, each one an iron ball weighing 24 pounds, glowed red. "It's hot, sir!" a sweat-soaked man shouted through the crooked passage that led from the furnace crypt. "We are ready!" An officer outside the crypt called up to the nearest battery. The guns had already been charged with their bags of powder, over which had been rammed thick layers of felt that had been soaked with water. The felt was there to stop the red-hot shot prematurely igniting the powder. "Bring the shot!" a man shouted from the battery. A dozen men manhandled the red-hot round shot onto their cradles. The cradles were like stretchers, and at their centres were shallow iron dishes for holding the heated shot. "Quick now!" the officer said, as the men hurried from the crypt and up the stone steps to the waiting guns. The round shot cooled quickly, losing their glow, but the officer knew the heat was deep in the iron's heart, and when the great guns fired, the redness would come back. A thoroughly heated 24-pound shot could cool for an hour and still retain enough fire in its belly to ignite wood. They were lethal against ships. "Wait!" a new voice called. The commander of Kronborg Castle, a lieutenant general who had been hastily summoned from his bed, hurried up the battery steps. He wore a tasselled nightcap and had a black woolen gown over his long nightshirt. "The shot's newly heated, sir," The battery officer, a captain, pointed out respectfully as the furnacemen lowered the cradles beside the waiting barrels, where the gunners had giant pincers ready to manoeuvre the shot into the cannons' muzzles. The captain wanted to ram the first 6 guns and hear the felt-wadding hiss. He wanted to see the round shot glowing as they seared across the sea to leave 6 streaks of redness in the dark. But the fortress's commander would not give the order to load. Instead, the general climbed into the lip of an embrasure and just gazed out to sea. Countless ships were entering the channel. They looked ghostly in the night, for their white sails were touched by the wan moonlight. They seemed motionless, for there was small wind this night. The general stared. There were hundreds of ships out there, far too many for his handful of guns, and those spectral vessels were bringing guns, horses, and men to Denmark. Beyond the fleet, on the Swedish shore, a scatter of glimmering lights showed in the town of Helsingborg. "Have they fired on us?" he asked the captain. "No, sir," the captain said. The redness was fading on the waiting shot. "Not yet, sir." But just then a dull boom sounded from the distant fleet, and the general saw a flash of red illumine one of the black and yellow hulls. "Sir!" The captain was impatient. He wanted his guns to pour their red heat into the dark bellies of the British fleet. He imagined that fleet burning, saw its sails writhing with flame and the sea shivering with fire. "Wait!" the general said. "Wait!" Another gun fired at sea, but there was no trundling sound of round shot in the air, and no splash of a falling shot. There was just the cannon's dull boom fading in the night, then renewing itself as a third gun fired. "They are making a salute," the general said. "Return it. No shot." "We salute them?" The captain sounded incredulous. The general wrapped his nightgown tighter against the night's chill, then stepped down from the embrasure. "We are not yet at war, Captain," he said reproachfully, "and they are offering us a salute, so we shall return the compliment. 15 guns, if you please." The red-hot round shot cooled. The ships ghosted southwards. They carried an army that had come to crush Denmark, and Denmark saluted it. Sharpe could hear voices coming from the parlour across the hall, but the conversation was in Danish, so he learned nothing, though he presumed Skovgaard was telling his daughter of Britain's perfidy. A clock in the house struck 10 and was followed by the cacophony of the city's bells. Light flared briefly under the small dining-room's door as Skovgaard or his daughter carried candles upstairs. Then Sharpe heard the house shutters being closed and their bolts slammed home. Someone tested the door of the room in which he was imprisoned, and, satisfied that it was securely locked, pulled the key from the door and walked away. Sharpe had not been idle. He had explored the room to discover a bureau with drawers, but they held nothing useful, merely linens. He had groped for fire-dogs in the hearth, thinking he might use them to break down the door, but the fireplace was empty. He had tried the door, but it was solid, locked, and immovable. So now he waited. Lavisser would kill him. Skovgaard might think the renegade guardsman was a hero, but Sharpe knew better. The Honourable John Lavisser was a thief and a killer. He was escaping from debt in England, and it was no longer any wonder that the first man appointed to accompany Lavisser had died, because Lavisser had doubtless wanted a clean start in his new country. Sharpe was nothing but dirt to be swept out of his way. And Skovgaard was no help. The Dane was dazzled by Lavisser's patriotic gesture and absurdly impressed that Lavisser was a gentleman with royal connections. So, get out of here, Sharpe thought. get out before Lavisser brought Barker to do his dirty work. But the dining room's door was locked, and its walls were solidly panelled. Sharpe had tried to lift the floorboards, but they were firmly nailed, and he could get no purchase. Yet there was a way out. He did not want to try, but escape was there, and he had no choice. Or a bad choice. He could wait till morning, and then be handed over to Lavisser's mercies, or he could do what he feared to do. Jem Hocking had once tried to sell the young Richard Sharpe to a chimney sweep, only Sharpe had run away. Sweeping was a death sentence. Some boys got trapped in chimneys and suffocated, while the rest were coughing up bloody scraps of their lungs long before they were full grown. So Sharpe had run away, and he had never stopped running since. But now he must try and climb like a sweep. Be sure your sin will find you out. He thought of that text as he stooped into the wide hearth. It was clean, but he could smell the rank soot in the shaft above him. He pushed his hands up to find a brick ledge a couple of feet above the hearth's throat. He did not want to do this. He was frightened of becoming trapped in the narrow black passage, but it was the only way out. Or rather, he hoped it was a way out, but he could not be sure. It was possible that the chimney served only the one hearth, in which case it would become ever narrower and he would be blocked. But it was far more likely that this flue would join another. Go up this shaft, he told himself, then drop down the other. It will be easy, he tried to reassure himself. A 10-year-old could do it. He hauled on the ledge with his hands and scrabbled with his boots to find some purchase on the tiled hearth. He slipped a couple of times, then managed to push and pull his way up through the chimney's throat. The air stank, but this first bit was easy enough, and he clambered onto the ledge and knelt there while he groped up again and felt the flue becoming narrower. The house was only a couple of years old, but that had been long enough to leave a thick deposit of soot that crumbled under his fingers and fell into his hair and eyes. His mouth was full of it. He tried to spit, but half-choked instead. He could hear the flakes of soot and clinker rattling down into the hearth. Suppose Skovgard was still downstairs. Suppose someone lit a fire. Common sense told him that was unlikely, but the fear would not go away. He tried to stand, but the chimney bellied in at the sides, and at first he could not squeeze past the bulging bricks, so he twisted sideways and tried again. He managed to force his way up into the black hole, but the masonry inside the chimney was crudely pointed, and his clothes kept snagging on mortar. He heaved the first 2 times it happened, and heard his coat rip, but then the fabric was caught again, and he knew the shaft could only get narrower, and so he dropped back to his knees, twisted around, and fell back into the fireplace. He crawled into the room where he gasped for breath and poured soot from his eyes. If it were to be done, he thought, then it would have to be done naked. He stripped, then nerved himself and went back into the hearth. He climbed onto the ledge, twisted sideways and stood up. It was easier now, though the rough brickwork gouged and scraped his skin. The flue was so narrow that the masonry pressed against his shoulder blades and chest. It was like being buried alive, he thought. Every time he breathed, he could feel the eddy of air on the bricks in front of his eyes and smell the rank fumes of old soot. He could see nothing, but the constriction of the chimney pressed black and filthy like the cold walls of a tomb. He shivered. The flue was barely wide enough from front to back, but it was a few inches wider than his shoulders, and he used that space to push himself up. He could scarcely bend his legs. Each time he wanted to move, he had to lift a foot a few inches to find a rough ledge in the chimney's pointing, then shove himself up. He hooked his fingers into the small spaces between the brick courses, scrabbling through the thick deposit of soot that cascaded thick onto his face. He tried to breathe through his nose, but soot clogged it, and he was forced to half choke through his dry mouth. He could not look up because the chimney was too narrow for him to tilt his head back, and so he reached up, desperate to find the place where another flue joined this shaft. Inch by inch he climbed. He slipped once, and only stopped himself sliding back to the ledge by ramming his shoulder into the wall. He scraped his foot down the flue, seeking any purchase, and found a space where the pointing had come out of the brickwork. He shoved himself another inch, then another, but the chimney's sides were narrowing. He had his arms above his head, but the sides of the shaft were touching his shoulders now, and he had to fight for every inch. His eyes stung, even though he kept them closed. His throat was dry, the soot was sour in his gullet, and the stench made him want to retch. He lifted his left foot 2 inches, all he could manage, and found a rough piece of masonry. He put his weight on it, and the mortar broke away, clattering down to the hearth below. He held on with his hands, found another tiny ledge, and shoved himself up. The hair on the back of his head brushed against bricks, and he sensed the shaft was narrowing even more, and he felt a terrible despair because he would be blocked, maybe even stuck. But then, quite suddenly, his right hand groped in nothingness. He flailed for a heartbeat, then discovered that the bricks above him sloped steeply away, and he knew he had come to the place where 2 flues joined. All he had to do now was wriggle up, then drop down into the second flue and pray it was as wide as the first. He found a foothold, then pushed and slid and wriggled until there was just empty black space in front of his face. He paused, stretching out his hand to explore the mound of bricks where the flues joined, and felt a fierce elation. He would damn well do it. He hooked his hands over the breastwork, hauled himself up, twisted so his belly would slide over the mound, and then rammed his head painfully against bricks. The flues joined to make a chamber that was wide but very low, and the chimney leading up to the roof was much too narrow to climb. He could feel a draught from that upper chimney, though he could still see nothing. He forced his eyes open, even though they stung terribly, but through the tears he could see no glimmer of moonlight from the upper chimney, and no light from the second flue. He groped in the dark. He had reckoned on climbing above the join and lowering himself into the second flue, but there was not enough space in the chamber. How the hell did they clean their chimneys here? Maybe small boys just scoured the lower flues, and brushes were used from the roof to clean the higher shafts, for even the smallest child could not climb into that narrow upper chimney, and Sharpe knew he could not clamber over the breastwork, for there was scarce a foot of space above it. Which meant he would have to slither over it and dive head first into the second flue. Every breath was a mix of air and soot. He was desperate for clean air, for water. He sneezed, then went very still, fearing that someone would have heard him. He was making enough noise anyway, for every movement dislodged great chunks of soot that rattled down to the hearths below. But he heard nothing. Presumably father and daughter had gone to their rooms, and the servants were either in the attics or the basement. He forced himself over the breastwork, sliding on his belly while the bricks above scraped on his back. He could feel down into the second flue now, but suddenly he was stuck fast. He could bend his upper body over the joint in the shafts, but his legs would not follow. He tried to find handholds to jerk himself forward, but the mortar pointing just broke off in his fingers. He could not move his legs at all. He jerked and pushed himself from side to side, achieving nothing. He even tried to push himself back, desperate to free himself from the black grip of the shallow chamber, but he was stuck, jammed like a stick in the bend of a pipe. So, turn over, he told himself. Turn over so that his legs would bend at the knee and let him slide on his back into the second flue. He tried, and there was just enough space to half-twist himself, but then he jammed again. Yet it was the only way. He would die here otherwise, smothered by soot. He swore under his breath, then twisted again, and this time he forced his hip against the brick above him, and when it stuck, he twisted again, using his weight to grind his hips round. Bricks and mortar cut into him. He could feel blood trickling down the lacerated skin, but he gritted his teeth and lurched again and again, each time gaining a fraction of an inch and cutting deeper into his flesh. Then, suddenly, he had made it. He had turned, and he was lying on his back with his belly up to the top chimney, and he could let his head fall, so that he was slanting down into the second flue. He slid down, and the weight of his head and chest pulled on his hips as the blood ran warm down his belly. He reached down with his hands, found a ragged joint in the bricks, and pulled, and then he was half falling, half twisting, and his legs could at last bend over the flue's mounded joint. He was falling, but he rammed his hands and spine against the bricks. He tore his palms, ripping skin and flesh away, but he checked his fall. He was going head first down the second flue now, and it was much easier than climbing. All he had to do was use his bloodied hands to brake himself, and so he let himself drop, inch by inch, until he came to the chimney's throat, and then there was no way of stopping himself, so he just let go. He fell into an empty hearth. The air felt cool and wonderful. He curled up, feeling the soot flake down on him, and just shuddered for a few seconds. He had thought he would die up there. He remembered the grip of the brickwork, the black shroud all about him, and he wanted to stay curled up. "Grace," he said her name aloud, as though her spirit could come and give him strength. Grace. He did not believe she was gone forever. It seemed to him that she hovered about him, a guardian angel. He crawled out of the hearth to find he was in Skovgard's study. A very faint moonlight showed through the higher windows. The lower ones were shuttered. He crossed the room, flinching from the pain in his hips, and lifted the locking bar from one pair of shutters. The shutters were heavy, so heavy he realized they were made of iron. Skovgard, he thought, was a very cautious man. The window served as a door to the garden, and he unbolted it, then flinched as the hinges squealed. The cool night air felt wonderful. There was just enough moonlight for him to see his pack, coat, hat and sabre still on the chair in the study. His uniform was inside the pack, and he reckoned he would have to wear the green jacket, for the key to the small dining room had been taken away, and he did not see how he could get back into the room where he had left his torn clothes without waking the whole household. He would lose the guineas he had stolen on board the Cleopatra, and he would have to manage without boots, but that was better than being Lavis's victim. The thing to do, he told himself, was to get the hell away from this place. But before he dressed, he wanted to wash the filth off his lacerated skin. He walked into the garden and saw a great rain butt under a downspout. He lifted off the lid to find it almost full of water, and so he climbed inside, lowering himself gently, for the water was cold, and the sound of it spilling over the edge would be too loud if he just dropped. He ducked under, rubbing his skin, his hair, and the bleeding cuts on his hips. He gulped down the water, then just crouched in the huge barrel. He had to get away, he knew that. But then what? He supposed he had no option but to wait for the British Army to arrive, and then crawl back to Sir David Baird as a failure. He climbed out of the water and, dripping, went back into the study. He opened his pack and took out a dirty shirt and his rifleman's uniform. It might not be sensible to wear such a uniform this close to Copenhagen, but he could cover it with his greatcoat. He pulled on the black trousers, buttoned the green jacket, then tied the red sash and the sabre belt about his waist. A soldier again, and it felt good. It felt truly good. God damn it, he thought, but he would make Lavisa pay. Except he could see no way of getting revenge on the guardsman. For the moment he just had to escape, but he reckoned there was time to search Skovgard's study for anything useful. He went to the side table where the Dane kept his pipes and struck a light with the tinderbox. He lit 2 candles, then crouched by the leather-topped desk. The 7 drawers were locked, but the poker from the hearth made a stout crowbar that easily shattered the first lock. It splintered noisily, and Sharpe froze, waiting for evidence that the sound had woken someone. He heard nothing, so levered the other drawers open and brought the candles closer. 6 of the drawers held nothing but papers, but in the 7th he found his folding knife and the pistol which Skovgard had used to threaten him. The gun was one of a pair, and they were beautifully balanced weapons with long barrels, chased with silver. He thought at first they were dueling pistols, but when he probed one barrel, he found it was rifled. This was no aristocratic toy, but a killing machine, expensive and deadly. He opened a frizzen and saw the gun was primed. He drew out the ramrod and slid it down both barrels to check the pistols were loaded, then looked in the drawer for more ammunition, which he found in a tooled leather box that held a silver powder flask and a dozen spare bullets. The spout of the powder flask had a measuring chamber to ensure that the pistols were charged with exactly the right amount of powder. He put the flask and bullets into a pocket, then thrust the 2 pistols into his belt. "Thank you, Skovgard," he said under his breath. He pulled on the coat and hat. There was little left in the pack that he needed, so he just put the 22 guineas, the sewing kit and his telescope into his coat pockets and left the pack where it was. A sudden noise made him turn in alarm, but it was only the clock on the mantel whirring itself ready to strike midnight. He blew out the candles and went back into the garden. He closed the shutters and glass doors, then crossed a terrace of flagstones and went down a grassy slope. There were a dozen other houses in view, but all were a good distance away and all of them dark. A brick wall enclosed Skovgard's garden, but there was a gate next to the stables which he guessed led to an alley. He turned and looked back to see a single light gleaming soft behind louvered shutters. For some reason he decided that must be Astrid's room, and he had a sudden vision of her high, pale forehead, golden hair and bright eyes. He felt guilty then, thinking of Grace. "Go," he told himself, "go west into the country, steal some boots and wait for the British forces to come." He did not want to do that, for it would mean slinking back to Sir David Baird with his tail between his legs. But what choice was there? Then he heard the small scuffling sound. A cat? He crouched. Not a cat, for he could hear footsteps. Someone was prowling about the house and trying to make as little noise as possible. A servant, perhaps, checking that the house was secure. Some servants plainly lived in the carriage house by the stables, and maybe, as a final duty, one of them patrolled Skovgard's house. Yet the steps sounded like more than one man. None of them carried a lantern, and they were moving with a deliberate stealth. Sharpe moved to the dark shadow of a bush and waited. The quarter moon was misted, and half hidden behind some tall pines, yet it cast just enough light for Sharpe to see 6 dark shapes appear at the side of the house. They came slowly, edging past the rain butt, where one of them inadvertently kicked the butt's wooden lid, which Sharpe had left on the path, and all 6 went very still.
This ends Disc 4.
Sharpe's Prey.
Disc 5.
They waited for what seemed a long time. Then one of them tried the back door, found it locked, and moved on to the study's tall windows. There they discovered the unlocked glass door and the unbarred shutters. They paused, suspecting a trap. But then, after a whispered consultation, they all went inside. Sharpe had seen no faces, but the size of one man had suggested Barker, and the height of another might have been Lavisser. Yet why would Lavisser come like a thief in the night? He had an invitation. He could wait till morning. Sharpe could make no sense of it, so he just stayed where he was. He heard the muffled squeal of the study door opening. The men would discover his escape soon enough, and then they would presumably leave. He doubted they would search the garden, but would probably look for him on the nearby roads, so he reckoned he was safe in his hiding place. It would not be a long wait, he told himself. Then he saw a glimmer of light in an upstairs window. It flickered briefly, then faded, as though someone was carrying a candle down a passage. Go now, he thought, while they were upstairs. But then he heard the scream. It was brief, a woman's voice, cut off as soon as it sounded. More lights showed in the upstairs windows. A man shouted peremptorily, and Sharpe just listened in astonishment. They had not come for him, but for Skovgaard. Then it could not be Lavisser. But who? The Danes themselves? But why come in the night? And men who came in the night implied harm, which meant Skovgaard would need help, and Sharpe needed Skovgaard if he was not to fail utterly, and so he abandoned his resolve to flee westwards and instead moved towards the house, throwing off his greatcoat because it hampered him. He paused briefly at the study window, but could hear nothing beyond the shutters, and so he stepped through. The room was dark, but a faint light showed at the door to the hall. He crossed the room, wincing whenever a board squeaked beneath the rugs. The hall was empty, and the light was coming from the upper landing, where he could hear voices raised in anger. They spoke Danish, and he had no idea what was being said. He crossed the hall to the parlour, where Astrid had been playing the harpsichord. It was pitch black inside, but he flattened himself beside the door and listened. It sounded as though the whole household, including the servants, was being herded down the stairs. Then someone kicked the parlour door wide open to let in a wash of yellow lamplight, but blessedly no one came inside, and Sharpe had time to move behind a screen printed with windmills and ducks. He accidentally kicked a flower-painted chamber pot, but no one heard because of the racket outside. He waited again. Then he heard Lavisser's voice. He was sure it was Lavisser, but he was not speaking Danish or English. French? Sharpe was almost certain it was French. He was giving orders, and a moment later a lamp was brought into the parlour, and Sharpe heard footsteps. There was a mirror between the shuttered windows, and in its reflection he could see 2 maidservants, both in nightgowns and caps, being pushed into the room. The elderly manservant followed. Then Astrid entered, and behind her a man with a pistol. Lavisser spoke to him in French. "You want me in there, sir?" a voice asked in English. It was Barker. "No, get Sharpe," Lavisser answered, and then, still using English, he spoke to Astrid. "You will not be hurt, I promise." "But my father—" Astrid sounded distraught, and no wonder. She was in a long nightdress, and her blonde hair fell loose on her shoulders. "I want to be with my father." "Your father has become rich by fighting France," a voice replied. It was not Lavisa who spoke, but a woman. Another mystery on a night gone askew. "And your father should have known the consequences of such foolishness," the woman finished. She had an accent. French? The door closed. Astrid sat on the harpsichord bench, weeping, as the Frenchman waved the 3 terrified servants towards the sofa. Sharpe should have been visible to him in the mirror, but the rifleman was in deep shadow, and the Frenchman suspected nothing. He did not even look behind the screen, but just leaned against the closed door with his pistol held low. He yawned. What did he have to fear? 3 women and an elderly man? Sharpe pulled one pistol from his belt. So Lavisa worked with the French. The idea was repugnant, but it made sense. The enemy must have their agents in London, and how better to snare fools than to find them playing cards at Almack's and the other rich gaming clubs. And they had snared a choice one in Lavisa. But if Lavisa was now planning on killing Skovgard, then Sharpe did not have much time. He wrapped the pistol in the hem of his jacket to muffle the distinctive sound of the flint being cocked. He'd been out of his depth ever since he had arrived in Denmark, enduring insult, religion, and imprisonment. But now he knew what he was doing. He was back where he belonged, and he was smiling as he stepped out from behind the screen. He held the pistol at arm's length, and it took the Frenchman at least 2 seconds to register his presence, and by then the gun was just 3 feet from his head. Sharpe motioned with his left hand. "Put the gun down, monsieur," he spoke softly. The man looked as if he was about to shout. "Please," Sharpe said. "Make a noise so I can kill you. Please." He was still smiling. The Frenchman shook slightly. There was something about the eyes of the green-jacketed man that told him death was hovering very close in this comfortable parlour, and so, sensibly and very slowly, he laid his own pistol on the floor. Astrid and the servants were staring wide-eyed. Sharpe kicked the Frenchman's pistol across the polished floorboards. "Down," he told the man, indicating what he meant with his left hand. The man lay on his belly, anxiously twisting his head to see what Sharpe was doing. "I wouldn't watch, miss," Sharpe said to Astrid, then put a finger to his mouth to show that she should be silent. He had a problem now. The Frenchman had seen Sharpe put the finger to his lips and must have realized that noise was his best friend, which meant Sharpe was unwilling to shoot him because the sound of the pistol would bring the other intruders into the parlour. The man took a deep breath, and Sharpe, desperate, kicked him brutally hard in the throat. He hurt his foot, for he had no boots, but he hurt the Frenchman even more. Astrid gasped, and the man began to choke as he clutched his gullet, and his feet drummed on the floor. Sharpe dropped on the man's back to hold him still. He needed to make the man senseless, but that would take a deal of violence and must inevitably make more noise. Skovgard's expensive pistols, though deadly, were not heavy enough to use as clubs. The Frenchman, catching his breath, tried to heave Sharpe off his back, so Sharpe hit him hard, bouncing the man's skull off the floorboards, but he still tried to twist Sharpe off. Sharpe hit him again, this time so hard that the man went momentarily still, and so gave Sharpe a chance to put the pistol down. He took out his folding knife and pulled out the blade. "Eyes closed, miss," he said grimly. "What?" "Shh," Sharpe said. "Tell the others to close their eyes. Quick now." Astrid whispered something in Danish as Sharpe felt the man tense under him. The Frenchman was about to make another effort to dislodge Sharpe, but the rifleman stabbed once with the short-bladed knife. It only took one thrust, right into the base of the skull, and the Frenchman gave a surprisingly strong spasm and then seemed to sigh. That was the only noise he made, and there was remarkably little blood. Sharpe pulled the dead man's collar up to conceal the wound, wiped the knife clean on the corpse's coat, then stood. "You can open your eyes now," he said. Astrid stared at Sharpe, then at the dead man. "He's just sleeping," Sharpe said. He picked up the man's pistol. It was a clumsy thing compared to Skovgard's sophisticated weapons, but it was loaded and gave him 3 shots. 4 men and 1 woman left. "Are there any guns in this room?" Sharpe asked Astrid. She shook her head. He knelt by the corpse and searched its clothes, but the man had no other weapons. So, 3 shots and 5 targets. He went to the door and put his ear to the wood. He could hear voices. Then he heard the sound of a key turning in a lock. There was a pause and sudden feet on the hall floor. Sharpe waited a heartbeat, then eased the parlour door open an inch. "He's gone," Barker said. "He can't have gone." That was Lavisser's voice. "He's gone," Barker insisted. Sharpe imagined Lavisser glancing at the shutters. That opportunely open window could only be explained by Sharpe's otherwise inexplicable absence. "Look outside," Lavisser said, "and be careful." The woman spoke, using French. Then Lavisser talked in Danish. There was a pause. Then Skovgard, for it could be no one else, gave a shout that turned into a terrible groan and a yelp of pain. Astrid gasped, and Sharpe whipped round and put his finger to her lips. Skovgard shouted again. It was the sound men made on the battlefield when they were wounded and did not want to scream. It was involuntary, a wordless exhalation of pain. Sharpe pointed at Astrid. "Stay here," he said firmly, then pulled open the parlour door. Barker was probably in the garden by now, so that left 4 targets and 3 shots. What had Baird called him? A thug. So he would be a thug now, and a damned good one. He crossed the hall and saw that the study door was ajar. He dared not push it open further, for the hinges squealed so badly, but he wished he could see more of what was going on in the study. He could just make out that Skovgard had been tied to the chair behind his desk, on which stood a lantern, and in its light Sharpe could see that the front of Skovgard's nightshirt was drenched in blood. Then he saw a man lean forward and force the Dane's mouth open. The man held a pair of pliers. They were making him talk. A second man came into view to help keep Skovgard's mouth open. The Dane tried to clamp his jaws shut, but the second man used a knife to force his teeth apart. The woman spoke. Skovgard shook his head, and the pliers' jaws closed on one of his teeth. Skovgard groaned and made a huge effort to shake his head, but one of the men struck him hard across the skull. Then the Dane moaned as the pliers began to exert pressure. Sharpe fired at the man wielding the pliers. He used one of Skovgard's rifled pistols, and it was as accurate as it was beautiful. He had expected the long rifled barrel to give the gun a heavy kick, so he had aimed a little low, but the weapon was so exquisitely balanced that it hardly quivered. It jetted smoke halfway across the study as the ball struck the man in his neck. A jet of blood fountained up over Skovgard's desk. Sharpe dropped the gun, plucked Skovgard's second pistol from his belt, and pushed the door fully open. The man who had been holding Skovgard's head was quick, incredibly quick, and he was already bringing up a pistol, and so Sharpe, who had reckoned to take Lavisser with his second shot, fired at him instead. Smoke thickened in the room, shrouding Sharpe's target, but he had the third pistol in his grip now, and he aimed it at Lavisa, who had seized the woman's hand and was pulling her towards the open window. Sharpe fired. The Frenchman's heavy pistol kicked like a mule and made far more noise than the expensive guns. He heard the crash of breaking glass. Someone squealed in pain. Then Lavisa and the woman disappeared into the night. Smoke writhed about the room as Sharpe ran to Skovgaard's side. The Dane stared in astonishment, blood trickling down his long chin. Sharpe ducked down behind the desk so that he offered no target to anyone in the garden. The second man he had shot was lying against the wall, twitching, and his pistol was on the floor. Sharpe picked the weapon up, then hurled the lantern into the fireplace. The lamp glass shattered, and the study was plunged into darkness. He went to the window, knelt and peered into the garden. He could see no one, so he closed the metal shutters and put the bar into place. Lavisa, it seemed, had fled. The 3 shots, coming in such quick succession, must have convinced him that he was up against more than one man. "Mr. Sharpe," Skovgaard said from the darkness. His voice was slurred. "Aren't you glad Britain sent an aging lieutenant?" Sharpe asked savagely. He crossed to the desk and leaned on it so his face was close to Skovgaard. "And damn you, you bloody fool!" He spat the words. "Damn you to bloody hell and all the bloody way back. But I was not sent to kill the Crown Prince." "I believe you," Skovgaard said humbly. His voice was thick because of the blood in his mouth. "And that was your hero, Lavisa, you fat-headed bastard." Sharpe, still angry, went to the parlour. "Your father needs water and towels," he told Astrid curtly, then picked up the lamp and went back to the study. There were shouts outside the house. The coachman and stable boys had evidently been woken by the shots and were now asking for reassurance from Skovgaard or his daughter. "Are those the 2 men who were with you earlier?" Sharpe asked Skovgaard, who was still tied to the chair. Skovgaard jerked his head towards the shutters. "That is them," he said indistinctly. "Are they guards?" "A coachman and a groom." Sharpe cut Skovgaard free, and the Dane went to the window to reassure the men outside, while Sharpe knelt beside the wounded Frenchman. Except he was a dead man now. He had bled to death. Sharpe swore. Skovgaard frowned. "Lieutenant!" "I know. You hate base language, and after what you did to me, I don't give a bugger. But I hope this one was alive. He could have told us who was with Lavisa, but the bastard's dead." "I know who they were," Skovgaard said bitterly. Then his daughter came into the room and screamed when she saw her father. She ran to him, and he clasped her to his blooded nightgown and patted her back. "It's all right, dearest," Skovgaard spoke in English. Then he saw the sooty marks on the big rug. His eyes widened, and he stared, first at the black footprints, then at Sharpe. "Is that how you escaped?" "Yes." "Good God," Skovgaard said faintly. A maid had brought water and towels, and Skovgaard sat at the desk and rinsed his mouth out. "I only had 6 teeth left," he said, "and now there are just 4. 2 bloody teeth lay on the desk next to his ivory false teeth and the broken lenses of his reading spectacles. "You should have listened to me when I first came here," Sharpe growled. "Mr. Sharpe," Astrid chided him. "It's true," her father said. Astrid turned a troubled gaze on Sharpe. "The man in there," she gestured towards the parlour, "he's still sleeping." "He's not going to wake up," Sharpe said. 3 dead, Skovgaard sounded incredulous. "I wish it had been 5. Sharpe put the 2 good pistols on the desk. "Your guns," he said. "I was going to steal them. Why didn't you keep a pair in your bedroom?" "I did," Skovgard said, "only they took Astrid first. They said they'd hurt her if I didn't come out." "So who were they?" Sharpe asked. "I know one is your patriotic Lavisser, but the others?" Skovgard looked weary. He spat a mix of blood and spittle into a bowl, then smiled wanly when a maid brought him a robe that he wrapped about the bloody nightshirt. "The woman," he said, "is called Madame Visser. She is at the French embassy. Ostensibly, she is merely the wife of the ambassador's secretary, but in truth she seeks information. She collates messages from throughout the Baltic." He hesitated. "She does for the French, Lieutenant, what I did for the British." "A woman does that?" Sharpe could not hide his surprise, earning a reproachful look from Astrid. "She is very clever," Skovgard said, "and without mercy." "And what did she want?" Skovgard rinsed his mouth out again, then patted his lips with a towel. He tried to put in his false teeth, but his raw gums were too painful and made him wince. "They wanted names from me," he said. "The names of my correspondents." Sharpe paced the room. He felt frustrated. He had killed 3 men and wounded a 4th, if the blood on the small rug by the shutters was any indication. But it had all happened too quickly, and his anger was still high, still unslaked. So Lavisser was in French pay, and Lavisser had almost given Britain's Baltic spy master to the enemy, except that a rifleman had been waiting. "So, what now?" Sharpe asked Skovgard. The Dane shrugged. "You tell the authorities about this." Sharpe nodded towards the dead men behind Skovgard's desk. "I doubt anyone would believe us," Skovgard said. "Major Lavisser is a hero. I am a merchant, and you are what? An Englishman. And my erstwhile affection for Britain is well known in Denmark. If you were the authorities, who would you believe?" "So you'll just wait for them to try again?" Sharpe asked. Skovgard glanced at his daughter. "We shall move back to our house in the city. It will be safer there, I think. The neighbours are closer, and it is next to the warehouse, so I don't have to travel. Much safer, I think." "Just stay here," Sharpe suggested. Skovgard sighed. "You forget, Lieutenant, that your army is coming. They will lay siege to Copenhagen, and this house lies outside the walls. Within a week, I suspect, there will be British officers quartered here." "So you'll be safe." "If Copenhagen is to suffer," Skovgard said with a trace of his old asperity, "then I will share it. How can I look my workmen in the face if I leave them to endure a siege alone? And you, Lieutenant, what will you do?" "I'll stay with you, sir," Sharpe said grimly. "I was sent to protect someone from the French, and it's you now. And Lavis is still living, so I've work to do. And to start, I need a spade." "A spade?" "You've got 3 dead bodies in the house. Where I come from, we buried them." "But—" Astrid began to protest, but her voice trailed away. "That's right, miss," Sharpe said. "If you can't explain them, hide them." It took him most of what remained of the night, but he dug a shallow trench in the soft soil by the back wall of the garden and laid the 3 Frenchmen inside. He patted the earth down and covered it with some bricks he found beside the carriage house. And then, in a grey and dreary dawn, he slept. 11 miles north of Ollie Skovgard's house was the insignificant village of Vedbeck. It lay on the sea, halfway between Copenhagen and the fortress at Helsingør. The village held a handful of houses, a church, 2 farms, and a small fleet of fishing boats. Tarred sheds lined the beach where nets hung to dry on tall poles, and the burning charcoal of the herring smokers shimmered the air above the sand. Work started early in Vedbæk. There were cows to be milked and fishing boats to be hauled down to the sea. Yet this morning at dawn no one worked. The herring fires were dying, and the people of the village were ignoring their duties and standing instead on the low grassy ridge that backed the beach. They said little, but just stared seawards, where a fleet had appeared in the night. Closest to the beach were gun brigs and bomb ships that had moored so their great cannons and mortars could threaten any Danish troops who might appear on the shore. Beyond those small ships were frigates, and farther out still the great ships of the line, all of them with their gun ports open. There was no enemy threatening the fleet, but the guns were ready. Between the ships of the line and the frigates was moored a host of transport ships, around each of which was a smaller fleet of tenders, launches and longboats that nuzzled the bigger hulls like so many suckling pigs. Horses were being slung out of holds and lowered into the boats. No one in Vedbæk had ever seen so many ships, not at one time. At least a dozen of the village men had been sailors, yet even they had not seen such a fleet, not in Copenhagen, London, Hamburg, or in any other great port. Someone began ringing the church bell as an alarm, but the pastor hurried back into the village to silence it. "We have already sent a messenger," he told the enthusiastic bell ringer. "Sven has ridden to Horsham." There was a police barracks in Horsham, though what use the police would be the pastor did not know. They could hardly arrest a whole army, though doubtless they would send a warning to Copenhagen. Folk from Horsham and from the lesser villages nearby were already coming to Vedbæk to see the ships. The pastor worried that the spectators might resemble an army, and he did his best to disperse them. "Jarl, your cows are lowing. They must be milked." "I have girls to do that." "Then find them. There is work to do." But no one moved. Instead they watched as the first small boats headed for the shore. "Will they kill us?" a woman asked. "Only the ugly ones," someone answered, and there was nervous laughter. The man who had made the bad joke had been a sailor, and he had a great telescope that he had propped on his wife's shoulder. He could see a field gun being lifted out of a ship's belly and slung on a whip into one of the bigger launches. "Now they're sending a cannon to shoot Ingrid," he announced. Ingrid was his mother-in-law, and as big as a Holstein cow. A young lieutenant in the blue uniform of the Danish militia arrived on horseback. He was the son of a wheelwright in Sambjerg, and the only shots he had ever heard fired had been volleys of musketry emptied in the sand dunes as the militia practised. "If you are going to fight them," the pastor said, "then perhaps you should go down onto the beach. Otherwise, Christian, take off your jacket so they don't realize you are a soldier. How is your mother?" "She's still coughing, and sometimes there is blood. Keep her warm this coming winter." We will. The lieutenant stripped off his uniform jacket. No one spoke as the first few launches neared the shore. The sailors at the oars had long pigtails showing under their tarred hats, and their passengers were all in red uniforms and had big black shakos that made them seem very tall. One man was holding a flag, but because there was so little wind, the banner just hung limply. The launches seemed to be racing each other for the honour of being first ashore. They heaved in the small waves close to the beach. Then the first keels scraped on sand, and the red-coated men were leaping over the side. Form them up, Sergeant. Aye, aye, sir. You're not a bloody sailor, Sergeant. A plain yes will do. Aye, aye, sir. More boats grounded. The soldiers came out fast, and the sailors were already pushing the launches off the beach, turning and rowing them back to the transport ships. A lieutenant colonel in a black bicorn hat walked up the beach. He was accompanied by a major and 4 captains. The villagers moved politely aside as the lieutenant colonel pointed to a small hill a half-mile inland. 3 companies to picket that high ground, John. I'll send the first battery ashore to reinforce you. Colin, your men will stay here in case anyone disputes us. Colin, one of the captains, looked at the villagers. They seem well disposed, sir. Keep them that way. Make sure the men behave. The lieutenant colonel turned to watch for the boat carrying his horse. The pastor approached him. "May I ask why you are here?" the pastor inquired in good English. "Good morning." The lieutenant colonel touched the tasselled tip of his bicorn hat. "Nice one, eh?" "Do you mean us harm?" the pastor asked nervously. "Nicholson!" the lieutenant colonel shouted at a surprised private standing in the front rank of a company drawn up on the beach. "Shoulder your piece. Aim at the sky. Cock. Fire." Nicholson obediently pointed his musket at a wisp of cloud and pulled the trigger. The flint fell on an empty pan. "Not loaded, father," the lieutenant colonel told the pastor. "We ain't here to kill decent folk. Not on a nice morning. Come to stretch our legs." He smiled at the pastor. "This your village?" "I am pastor here, yes." "I'm afraid you're going to have soldiery as company all day, so keep the kitchen fires hot, father, because the rogues like their tea. And if any man gives you any trouble at all, just see an officer and we'll have the bastard hanged. Good day." He touched his hat again and walked back down the beach to where his horse was being coaxed ashore. The beast had been afloat for over 2 weeks, and it staggered as though it was drunk when it reached the sand. The lieutenant colonel's orderly led it up and down for a while, then held it still while his master mounted. "Inland!" the colonel called. The first 3 companies marched inland, going to the high ground. More boats were landing now. A battery of field guns was being manhandled ashore, and more horses were taking their first unsteady steps. One horse, sprightlier than the rest, escaped its handler and trotted up the beach where it stopped, apparently surprised by the spectators. A gunner ran after it and seized its bridle. He winked at some girls standing just paces away. They giggled. 2 companies of soldiers in green jackets landed closer to the village, and that prompted many of the inhabitants to hurry back in case their houses were being plundered, though when they reached the main street they just discovered the green-jacketed men standing guard on their front doors. An officer was striding up the sandy street. "This is all private property," he was shouting, "and General Cathcart has given orders that any man who steals anything, I do not care how small or valueless a thing it is, will be hanged. Are you hearing this? You will be hanged. You will dance in the air, so keep your hands to yourselves. You will show respect to all civilians. Rifleman, you, the tall fellow, what's your name?" He knew all the men in his own company, but the tall man was from another. The rifleman, well over 6 feet tall, feigned astonishment that he should be singled out. "Me, sir. I'm Pat Harper, sir, from Donegal. What's in that sack?" Rifleman Harper turned an innocent expression on a sack that was lying against a cottage wall a few feet behind him. "Never seen it before in my life, Captain Dunnett, sir. Must have been left by one of the villagers, sir." Dunnett looked suspicious, but accepted the explanation. "You will stand guard here," he told the men, "until we are relieved. If you apprehend any man trying to thieve anything, you will arrest him and bring him to me, so that we can have the pleasure of hanging him." Captain Dunnet walked on down the street, repeating the orders. Another rifleman looked at Harper. "What's in the sack, Pat?" "3 pullets, Cooper, and they're dead, and they're also mine. And if you lay your thieving hands on them, I'll stuff their feathers down your gullet until you start shitting angels' wings." Rifleman Harper smiled. "Where did you find them?" "Where I looked for them, of course." "D'you see that girl?" Manco Harris said. They all turned to stare at a young woman with hair like fine-spun gold, who was walking up the street. She knew she was being admired, so lifted her head high and swung her hips as she strutted before the rifleman. "I think they shot me," Harris said, "and I've gone to heaven." "We're going to like it here, boys," Harper said, "so long as they don't hang us." 10 to 1 you'll be hanged, Harper." It was Captain Murray, Harper's company commander, who had appeared beside the house and now peered inside the sack. "That's not mine, Mr. Murray," Harper said. "Whatever it is, and I wouldn't tell you a lie, sir." "Perish the thought, Harper, perish the very thought, but I'll still expect a cold leg of what's not yours." Harper grinned. "Very good, sir." 3 battalions were on the beach now. The first field guns, hitched to their horses, were going inland to the high ground, and still more ships were ghosting in the light wind from the north. No shots had been fired, and no one had offered any resistance. The first generals were ashore, and their aides laid maps on the sand, while a squadron of the 1st Light Dragoons led their unsteady horses into the village, where a pump fed a long watering trough. "Hey, missus!" a rifleman accosted a woman who just looked at him fearfully. "Tea?" the man said, displaying a handful of loose leaves. "You can boil water?" Her husband, who had sailed aboard a Baltic trader that had made several voyages to Leith and Newcastle, understood. "Firewood costs money," he grumbled. "Here," the rifleman offered a copper. "It's good coin, that. English money. None of your foreign rubbish. Tea, eh?" So the riflemen had their tea. The high ground was secured, and the British Army was ashore. Chapter 6. The clouds at last fled Copenhagen, leaving a rinsed blue sky. A late summer sun glossed the copper roofs and shimmered the harbour, where scores of merchant ships, fearing the British fleet that had anchored 10 miles to the north, had taken refuge. The Amalienborg Palace lay west of the harbour. It was really 4 small palaces grouped about a courtyard, and was gracious rather than grand, intimate instead of intimidating, and it was there, on an upper floor overlooking the harbour, that the Crown Prince made his farewells to the city's notables. His Majesty was returning to Holstein. He had been in that southern province all summer, but had returned to Copenhagen when he heard that the British fleet had sailed for the Baltic. He had come back to encourage the citizens. Denmark, he said, did not want to fight. It had not started the quarrel and bore no ill will towards Britain, but if the British persisted in their outrageous demand to take the Danish fleet, then Denmark would resist. And that, the Crown Prince knew, meant that Copenhagen must suffer, for it was in the capital's secure inner harbour that the fleet was sheltered. Yet the British, the Crown Prince insisted, could not succeed. It was late in the year to begin a siege. It would take weeks to make a breach in the Great Walls, and even then there could be no certainty that an assault would succeed. Besides, Long before any breach was practicable, the prince would bring the Danish army back from Holstein and trounce the besieging forces. "So the British will not attack the city," the prince said forcefully, "but merely threaten it. It is a bluff, gentlemen, a bluff. There is no time for a siege." "Plenty of time for a bombardment," General Payman, who had been appointed the commander of Copenhagen's garrison, noted gloomily. "No!" The prince turned on the general. "No, no, no!" The prince knew well enough that the city feared a bombardment by mortars and howitzers that could loft their shells over the wall to leave the city a smoking ruin. "The British are not barbarians," the prince insisted, "and they will not risk an action that will earn the condemnation of all civilized people. There will be no bombing. The British will threaten it, just as they threaten a siege, but it is all bluff." Instead, he forecast, the British would blockade the capital and hoped that hunger would persuade the garrison to yield. "So we shall fill the city with food," he told General Payman, "and you must endure their blockade until the late autumn. Then I shall lead the army back from Holstein." Holstein was where the bulk of Denmark's army was guarding the southern frontier, which was threatened by a French army. Payman, an old man, straightened ponderously. He was white-haired, corpulent, and had never led troops into battle, but he had a reassuring presence. There was something about the 72-year-old Ernst Payman that suggested he could not be broken, and the prince was sure that Payman, above all the other generals, could give the city confidence, though Payman's next words smacked of nervousness. "It would be better, Your Majesty, if you came sooner." "It can't be done. Can't be done." The prince went to a window that overlooked the harbour. 3 small ships, all low in the water because of the weight of grain they were bringing to the city, were mooring among the swarm of Danish gunboats being readied for battle. The prince looked down at a table on which a map had been spread to catch the window's light. A valet followed him, holding the prince's hat, sword and sash, but the prince ignored him. "The British Navy," he explained, "will surely blockade Zealand, and we cannot ferry the army back if British ships are waiting." Payman stared gloomily at the map as if seeking inspiration. He found it in the sheer size of Zealand, the island on which Copenhagen stood. 3,000 square miles, he said. "They cannot watch the whole coast." "They only need watch the harbours, sir," Captain, now Major Laffisser, pointed out respectfully. "And that they can do with ships to spare," the prince added. "But they're not cats, Payman. They're not cats." "They are most assuredly not, sire," Payman said. The general was plainly confused by the prince's declaration, but did not like to admit his puzzlement. "They cannot see in the dark," the prince explained anyway, "which means that when the long nights of winter come, we can bring the army back to Zealand." He lowered his head so the valet could drape the sash over his shoulder, then raised his arms for the sword belt to be buckled. "We must wait for the long nights," he declared, "which means you must defend Copenhagen for 2 months, General. Just 2 months." "We can hold 2 months," Payman said firmly, "unless they bombard." "They won't," the prince said firmly. "The British will not want the deaths of innocent civilians on their conscience." "I do know that General Lord Cathcart is opposed to bombardment," Major Lavisser said, "though doubtless some of his subordinates will urge it on him." "Lord Cathcart leads the army, does he not?" the prince asked. "So let us hope he exercises his authority." "We could send the women and children away," Payman suggested, his face brightening at the thought. There would be fewer mouths to feed. Do that, the prince said, and you invite the British to bombard the city. No, the women stay, and the British, I assure you, will not commit a slaughter of the innocents. 2 months, General. Hold the walls for 2 months, and I shall bring the army back, and we shall crush them like lice. Like lice. The prince pulled on white gloves. His optimism was genuine. Until the British fleet had sailed, the biggest threat facing Denmark had been the French army on the southern frontier, but the arrival of the British would almost certainly deter any French attack. Why should the French assault Denmark when the British were turning Denmark into France's new ally? So there would be no fight in Holstein, and when the longer nights blinded the enemy fleet, the army could be brought back to Zealand, where it would hugely outnumber the British forces. "We shall win," the prince told Payman, "so long as you hold for 2 months. And you can hold, General. The walls are thick, the guns are plentiful." Payman nodded agreement. Like all the others in the room, he now wished that the government had spent more on Copenhagen's defences in the last few years, but even so, the ramparts were adequate. The walls were massive and reinforced by bastions, batteries, and forts. To the west, the city looked over its own wealthy suburbs, but between those houses and the city there was an open space for the guns to kill attackers, and a ring of canal-like lakes that served as a wide moat. The walls were not in the best of repair, but they mounted nearly 200 guns, while out in the suburbs, wherever high ground might offer British batteries a vantage point, new strongholds were being constructed of earth, stone and timber. The city had a garrison of 5,500 troops, which was not enough to man all those new forts, but Payman had 4,000 well-trained seamen, who had been the crews of the warships secured in Copenhagen's harbour, and the militia was being overwhelmed by volunteers. "We can give a good account of ourselves for 2 months," Payman declared. "So long as we are not betrayed," the newly promoted Major Lavisser intervened. His words cut across the room's mood of optimism. He shrugged, as if to suggest that he was reluctant to be the bearer of bad news. "There are British spies in the city, Your Majesty," he explained, "and they should be dealt with." "Spies?" The prince's protuberant eyes exaggerated his look of alarm. "I made inquiries before leaving London, sire," Lavisser lied, "and ascertained one name. I wish I could have discovered more, should more exist, but I still urge that this one man is arrested, put in the Gamelholm cells and interrogated." "Indeed he should," the prince agreed vigorously. "Who is he?" "A man called Skovgard, sire," Lavisser said. "Not Ollie Skovgard?" Payman boomed. "Do you mean Ollie Skovgard?" "I do." Lavisser was taken aback by Payman's sudden vigour. "You can rest assured he's no spy." The general spoke confidently. "He wrote to me this morning." Payman was talking to the prince now, and confessed he has helped the British in the past, but only in their struggle against France, and I dare say there are 12 men in this room who have done the same. The prince looked down at the map. He had a British mother, and had been well known for his pro-British sentiments, but he did not want to be reminded of those things now. "Skovgard assures me of his loyalty," Payman went on stolidly, "and I believe him. He's known to me by reputation, a worthy man. He worships at our saviours. He's a commissioner of the poor, and he is, as are we all, disgusted by the British behaviour. Arresting such a man will not help morale in the city, sire. This attack should unite us, not divide us." The prince tapped his finger on the map. "You are sure of his loyalty?" "He worships at our saviours," Payman repeated, as though that answered the prince's question. "He volunteered this information, sire. He is no spy, but merely a merchant whose business suffered from French depredations. He tried to protect himself by assisting the enemies of France. We would punish a man for that? No, the prince decided. We shall leave him alone." He smiled at Lavisa. "Men are finding their true allegiances in these hard times, Major. You did. And the same is true of this man, Skovgard. So let us not worry about past loyalties, huh? We should join hands to fight the real enemy." He led his entourage towards the wide stairs. "Hold for 3 months," he encouraged Payman, adding a month to his expectations. "And don't forget, we have Kastenschiold." "Kastenschiold?" Payman exclaimed. General Kastenschiold was raising troops in southern Zealand, but Payman doubted there would be enough to make any difference. "I have great hopes of Kastenschiold," the prince declared. "He can raid the British lines. He can harry them. Our enemies have not reckoned on Kastenschiold." He smiled as he emerged from the palace door to be greeted by a great cheer. A huge crowd of Copenhagen's citizens had come to bid the prince farewell. They filled the quays and crammed every window that overlooked the harbour, while some of the younger ones had even swarmed up the 2-mast cranes which towered above the tallest church steeples. Ollie Skovgard and his daughter had been offered a vantage point on the balcony of the West India Company warehouse, from where they could look down on the prince as he walked to the water's edge. Sharpe had insisted on accompanying the Skovgards, dressed again in his civilian clothes that were torn, soot and mud-stained. Ollie Skovgard had not wanted him to come. "This is Copenhagen," he said. "We are safe." "You were safe 2 nights ago?" Sharpe had inquired acidly. Then Astrid, a peacemaker by nature, had begged her father to let Sharpe come, and Skovgard had reluctantly given in. Sharpe knew he had nothing to fear from Lavisa this morning, for the guardsman was among the uniformed dignitaries who accompanied the prince. Sharpe watched the renegade through his telescope and could see no evidence that Lavisa was wounded, which meant, probably, that his last bullet had struck the Frenchwoman. It was rumoured that the French embassy staff had all left the city, going to Kolding in Jutland, where the mad Danish king and his royal court were living. Sharpe, staring through his glass, saw Lavisa laughing at some jest by the prince. "Is Lavisa going to Holstein?" Sharpe wondered aloud. "Not if he's Payman's aide," Skovgard said. "Who's Payman?" "The tall man next to His Majesty. He's commander of the city." Lavisa was evidently staying. He offered the prince a salute, then leaned forward and shook the royal hand. The prince turned to the crowd, who cheered even louder, then walked down a flight of stone steps to where a launch waited to row him out to a frigate. The frigate, the fastest in the Danish fleet, would take him back to Holstein and the army. The rest of the Danish fleet was in the inner haven, and Sharpe could see its masts and spars above the tiled roofs of some warehouses on the far bank. "What I don't understand," he said, "is why you don't just sail the whole fleet away." "To where?" Skovgard asked sourly. His face was still swollen and white with pain. "Norway? It has no harbours so well protected as Copenhagen. We could send it to sea, I suppose, but there it will be intercepted by a British fleet. No, this is the safest place." The harbour was not at the edge of the city, but hollowed out of its very centre, and to reach it the British would have to get past the forts, walls, redoubts, guns and bastions. "It is here," Skovgard said, "because it is safe here." Some nearby folk heard the language and frowned at Sharpe. "American," he claimed. "Welcome to Copenhagen." The cannons of the Sixtus battery boomed out a 21-gun salute as the prince climbed the side of the frigate. "Did you hear that your army is landed?" Skovgard said. "They came yesterday morning, not so far away." He gestured to the north. "So they will be here within a few days. I think you should join them, Lieutenant." "And leave you to Lavisa?" "This is my city, Lieutenant, not yours, and I have already taken steps to ensure my own safety." "What steps?" Sharpe demanded. "I have written to Payman assuring him of my loyalty." "I'm sure General Payman will persuade the French to forget you," Sharpe said. "There are men who can be hired." Skovgard spoke icily. He was plainly irritated by Sharpe's constant company. On the previous morning, after Sharpe had buried the 3 Frenchmen, he had accompanied Ollie Skovgard to a dentist, while Astrid and the maids had packed the household belongings onto a wagon that would carry them to their old house in Ulfedsplatz. The dentist had proved to be an obese man who shuddered at the ravaged state of Skovgard's mouth. He had packed the empty sockets with shreds of sphagnum moss, then given him oil of cloves to rub on his tender gums, and promised he would have some new false teeth made. It seemed there were plenty of real teeth on the market these days, imported in the wake of the war in which France had beaten Austria and Russia. Austerlitz teeth, they were called. The rest of the day had been spent in moving furniture, linens, books and papers into the old house. The elderly servant was left to look after the new house, while the coachman and stable boys went to join the militia, taking Skovgard's horses with them. "I have no need of a carriage in the city," Skovgard had explained to Sharpe, "and our government needs horses to haul ammunition wagons." "You need protection," Sharpe said, "and you've just lost all your male servants." "The city needs them more than I do," Skovgard had answered, "and Axel has promised to find me some men. They will be cripples, probably, but a one-legged man can fire a musket." Skovgard had sounded bitter. "And there are plenty of cripples in Copenhagen, Lieutenant, thanks to your last attack." The bitterness had intrigued Sharpe. "Why didn't you break with Britain then?" he asked. Skovgard had shrugged. "My dear wife was alive. Besides, when Nelson attacked, I could see some justice in the British cause. We were denying them trade, and the lifeblood of a nation is trade. But now we deny you nothing except what is undeniably ours. Besides, I have never done anything to jeopardize Denmark. I simply assisted Britain to combat France, that is all. Now, alas, we shall be France's ally." 2 men in black, carrying valises stuffed with papers, were waiting for Skovgard when he returned from watching the prince's departure. Sharpe was instantly suspicious, but Skovgard evidently knew the men and hurried them into his office. "They are from the government," Axel Bang told Sharpe. "What do they want?" "Perhaps they have come for you, Lieutenant." Sharpe ignored that jibe. He walked down the centre aisle of the big warehouse. "Where does that lead?" He pointed to a staircase that vanished in the dusty rafters of the high roof. He wanted to check every door and window, looking for any place where men might break into the premises. "It goes to my upper chamber," Bang said, meaning a loft, "where I sleep now that Mr. Skovgard has returned." "Lost your house, have you?" "I do not mind," Bang said, unctuously. "It is not my house, and it is a blessing to have Miss Astrid back." "A blessing for you, or for her?" "For both of us, I think. It is like things were before they moved. It is good. Sharpe could find no weaknesses in the warehouse. Too much of value was stored in the place, and Skovgard had made it virtually thief-proof to protect the sacks of indigo, piles of jute and barrels of pungent spices that reminded Sharpe of India. "So what does the government want with Skovgard?" he asked Bang. "They want to know if any of these goods belong to British merchants." "Why?" "Because they will confiscate them, of course. We are at war, Lieutenant." Sharpe looked at the dusty bales filled with barrels, sacks and crates. "And is any of this stuff British?" "No. We do not store goods for other merchants. It is all our own." "Good," Sharpe said, meaning there was no excuse for any more visits from officials. He turned on Bang. "Tell me, when you delivered Mr. Skovgard's letter, did you meet Lavisser?" Bang blinked with surprise at Sharpe's forceful tone. "I met Major Lavisser, yes. He was very gracious." "Did he ask you questions?" Bang nodded. "He wanted to know about Mr. Skovgard, so I told him he is a good merchant and a committed Christian." "Is that so?" "It is all God asks of us." Sharpe wanted to hit Bang. The man was nothing but a trumped-up clerk, but he had a sly and prickly pride about him. "What else did he ask you about Skovgard?" Bang pushed his long hair out of his eyes. "He asked if Mr. Skovgard had much to do with England. I said yes. I said he had many friends there, and that he rode there, that he had been married to an Englishwoman. Does it matter?" "No," Sharpe said. Lavisser must have guessed that Sharpe would get in touch with the man whose name had been given him by Lord Pumphrey, so when Skovgard's letter arrived, it simply confirmed that suspicion. And with the French on the point of evacuating their diplomatic mission, it must have seemed imperative to act immediately. "I don't understand why you ask me these questions," Bang protested. He was genuinely confused why Skovgard had moved back into the city, and the explanation that his employer merely wanted to avoid the imminent British was made inadequate by Sharpe's presence, and even more inadequate by Skovgard's swollen face. "I think," Bang told Sharpe, "that you have snared Mr. Skovgard in unseemly matters." "All you need to know," Sharpe said, "is that Mr. Skovgard is in danger. So, if any strangers come here, fetch me. Don't let them in. And if anyone asks you about Mr. Skovgard, tell them nothing. Nothing. Don't even say he's a Christian, because it's none of their damn business." Bang looked mournful at Sharpe's tone. "He is in danger? Then perhaps Miss Astrid is also in danger?" "Miss Astrid too," Sharpe said. "So just be watchful. Watch and pray, eh?" "But maybe I should accompany Miss Astrid?" Bang sounded cheerful suddenly. "She goes to the orphanage." "To the where?" "The orphanage. Every day she goes. I can go with her, yes?" "You?" Sharpe could not keep the contempt from his voice. "And what will you do if she's attacked? Pray for her? Bloody hell, Bang. If anyone goes with her, it's me." Bang made no protest, but there was resentment on his face when, later that afternoon, Sharpe and Astrid left the warehouse together. Sharpe had brushed his clothes and hidden Skovgard's 2 fine pistols under his coat. He wore his sabre. More men were wearing weapons, he noted. It had suddenly become fashionable since the British had landed. He also carried a big basket which contained crushed barley, rice and herrings. "We're taking it to the orphanage," Astrid explained. "Orphanage?" "It is an orphanage," she said, "and a hospital for children as well. It is where my son died." "I'm sorry." "He was very little. not even a year. He was called Niels, like his father. There were tears in her eyes, but she forced a smile and said they would walk the long way round, going along the harbour quay where the prince had embarked that morning. Sharpe's first instinct was to protest that his job was to protect her, and that he could do that best if she went straight to the orphanage and back home. Then he realised he did not want to be in Skovgard's gloomy warehouse. Skovgard himself was safe enough. He was in his office. He had a musket and had testily promised that he would allow no strangers into the warehouse, which meant Sharpe need not hurry back. Besides, Sharpe would rather be walking with Astrid, and so the two of them strolled in the sunlight, though they were forced to stop every few yards to greet Astrid's friends or acquaintances. She introduced him as an American seaman, which prompted no surprise, only enthusiastic welcomes. "It is a very little city," she explained, after another such meeting, "and most people know each other." "It seems a good city," Sharpe said. She nodded. "And I like living inside the walls. The house in Westerfeld can be lonely." She paused to show Sharpe the scorched walls of what had once been a great building. "That was the Christianborg Palace," she said sadly. "It was where the king lived before the big fire." "Another war?" "Just a fire, a great fire. Almost a third of the city was burned, and it is still not all repaired." The ruined palace was sheathed in a tracery of scaffolding, while makeshift huts, built in the remnants of great rooms, showed where some folk evidently still sheltered. "Poor Copenhagen," Astrid sighed. They walked on past the Amalienborg Palace, from where the Crown Prince had made his departure. A public path led through the central courtyard, and the handful of blue-coated guards took no notice of the folk strolling in the afternoon sunshine. A dozen farm carts, heaped with grain or turnips, were parked by the palace. The city was stocking itself for a siege. A few hundred yards beyond the palace was a small public garden, dominated by the great citadel that guarded the harbour channel. The garden, which was mostly lawn with a few scattered trees, was the fort's esplanade, the killing ground for the cannon that just showed in the high embrasures. The grass was piled with round shot and cluttered with ammunition tenders, but even here folk took the air, ignoring the soldiers, who were sorting the round shot and shells according to their calibers. Sharpe suspected the Danes planned to make a new battery here, one that could fire across the harbour mouth, where a small wooden jetty held a dozen men placidly fishing. "They are always here," Astrid said, "but I've never seen them catch anything." She pointed northwards, to where, on the horizon, a dirty grey mass showed like a low-lying cloud. Sharpe had seen just a sight on the morning of Trafalgar. It was a fleet. "Your friends," Astrid said sadly, "and they're coming here." "I wish they weren't." She sat on a bench facing the sea. "You look so like Niels," she said. "That must be hard." She nodded. "He was lost at sea. We don't know how. He was a captain, you see. He called his ship the Astrid, and he was carrying sugar from the West Indies. When he didn't come home, I thought perhaps his ship was being mended, but it wasn't so. We heard he had sailed, and then there was a big storm just a few days after. We waited, but he never came. But I used to see him every day. I would see a stranger in the street and think, 'That is Niels. He has come back.' Then the stranger would turn, and it would not be Niels." She was not looking at Sharpe as she spoke, but staring out to sea, and Sharpe wondered if she had come here in her early widowhood to look for her husband. "Then I saw you in the house." She turned her big eyes on Sharpe, "and I knew it was Niels. For a moment I was so happy. I'm sorry, Sharpe said awkwardly. He knew how she felt. For ever since Grace's death, he would see a dark-haired woman in the street and think it was Grace. He felt the same leap of the heart and knew the same dull ache that followed the disappointment.
This ends Disc 5.
Sharpe's prey.
Disc 6.
Gulls cried above the harbour channel. "Do you think we're really in danger?" Astrid asked. "You know what your father does?" She nodded. "I've helped him in the last few years, since Mother died. He corresponds, Lieutenant, that is all. He corresponds." "With folk in Europe and in Britain?" "Yes." She stared at the British fleet. "He does business all over the Baltic and all through the North German states, so he has scores of men who write to him. If a French column of artillery passes through Magdeburg, then he will know within a week." "And he tells the British?" "Yes." "Dangerous work," Sharpe said. "Not really. His correspondents know how to write safely. That's why I helped my father, because his eyes are not so good as they were. Some of the best ones send him newspapers. The French do not mind newspapers going to Denmark, especially if they are from Paris and full of praise for the Emperor. But if you open the paper and hold it against a window, you can see that someone has pushed a pin hundreds of times through the pages. Each pinprick is under a letter, and I just read the letters off in order, and that is the message." She shrugged. "It is not so dangerous." "But the French know who he is now," Sharpe said. "They want to know who writes to him, who sticks those pins in the newspapers. They want to stop the messages, and your father can give them the names. So it is dangerous." Astrid said nothing for a while. She gazed at a gunboat that was being rowed out of the harbour. There was a heavy boom made from chained logs protecting the entrance, but it had been hauled aside to let the gunboat pass. The ship had a tall mast on which a sail was furled, but the small wind was against the ungainly craft, and so a score of oarsmen were pulling on long sweeps to crawl out of the channel. The boat had an ugly bill of a bow on which 2 heavy and very long-barrelled cannons were mounted. 24-pounders, Sharpe guessed. Guns that could fire a long way and hit hard. And there were a score of other gunboats tethered against the far quay, where powder and shot were being unloaded from carts. Other boats were bringing food into the city. "I hope the danger was past," Astrid said after a long while, "now that the French are gone. But at least it stops life being dull." "Is life dull?" Sharpe asked. She smiled. "I go to church, I do the accounts, and I look after father," she shrugged. "It must sound very dull to you." "My life's become dull," Sharpe said, thinking of his job as a quartermaster. "You?" She was teasing him, her eyes bright. "You are a soldier. You climb chimneys and kill people." She gave a shudder. "Your life is much too exciting." Sharpe stared at the gunboat. The rowers, stripped to the waist, were hauling hard, but the boat was making little progress. He could see the tide rippling against the piers of the jetty, and the gunboat was fighting the flood, but the oarsmen pulled on as though every burning muscle would help turn back the British. "I'm 30 years old," he said, "and I've been a soldier for 14 years. Before that I was a child. I was nothing." "No one is nothing," Astrid protested. "I was nothing." Sharpe sounded angry. "I was born into nothing, raised into nothing, expected to do nothing. But I had a talent. I can kill." "That is not good." "So I became a soldier, and I learned when to kill and when not to kill. I became something, an officer, but now they don't want me. I'm not a gentleman, see? I'm not like Lavisser. He's a gentleman. He knew he had sounded jealous and angry and was embarrassed. He had forgotten, too, the reason for being with Astrid, and he guiltily turned and looked at the folk taking the summer air on the fort's esplanade. But no one appeared to be taking any undue notice of the two of them. No Frenchmen were lurking, and there was no sign of Barker or Lavisser. "I'm sorry, Mum," he said. "Sorry? Why?" "Tide has turned," Sharpe said, changing the subject and nodding at the gunboat. "Those lads are making some progress now." "We must make some progress too," Astrid said, standing. Then she laughed. "You make me feel very rich." "Rich? Why?" "To have a manservant carrying the basket. Only the folk living on Amaliagade and Breadgade can afford such luxuries." They walked westwards, skirting the moat of the vast citadel, until they came to a poorer quarter of the city, though even here the houses were neat and clean. The single-storey homes had been built to a pattern, were brightly painted and in good repair. "This is the sailors' quarter," Astrid told Sharpe. "Nijboda, it is called. They all have ovens. 1 oven for every 2 houses. It is nice, I think." "Very nice." "My father was a sailor's son. He grew up in that street, Svanagaden. He was very poor, you see." She looked at him with big eyes, evidently trying to reassure him that she was no better born than himself. But Svanagaden, Sharpe thought, was a paradise compared to Wapping. "You reckon this is a poor area?" Sharpe asked. "Oh, yes," Astrid said seriously. "And I know about these things. Father is one of the commissioners of the poor, and I help with the correspondence." The orphanage was on the edge of Nijboda, close to the sailors' cemetery, where Astrid's son was buried. Astrid tidied the little grave, then bowed her head, and Sharpe wanted to embrace her when he saw the tears on her cheeks. Instead, he stepped back, giving her privacy, and watched the gulls wheeling over the citadel's ramparts. He thought of Grace and wondered what birds flew above her grave. She had been buried in a Lincolnshire church among her dead husband's family, and under a memorial tablet recording Lord William Hale's virtues. Sharpe imagined her spirit hovering over him. Would she approve that he was so drawn to Astrid? He turned and looked at the widow stooping over the tiny grave and knew he was falling in love. It was as though green shoots were coming from the hatred and fury that had obsessed him since Grace had died. Astrid stood and smiled at him. "Come," she said, "you must meet the children." She led him to the hospital where her son had died, and Sharpe could hardly believe it was also an orphanage. It was nothing like Brewhouse Lane. There was no high wall or spiked gate, though the upper windows were all equipped with iron bars. "That is to stop the boys being daredevils," Astrid explained. "Sometimes the older boys want to climb on the roof." "So it's not a prison?" "Of course not." She laughed at the idea, and indeed the orphanage looked anything but a prison. The 2-storey building was painted white and built about a courtyard where flowers grew in neat beds. There was a small chapel with a pipe organ, a simple altar and a high stained-glass window that showed Christ surrounded by small, golden-haired children. "I grew up in a place like this," Sharpe told Astrid. "An orphanage?" "A foundling home. Same thing. Wasn't quite like this, though. They made us work." "The children work here too," she said sternly. "The girls learn to sew, and the boys must learn to be sailors, see?" She had led him back into the courtyard, where she pointed to a tall flagpole that was rigged like a ship's mast. "The boys must learn to climb it, and the girls make all those flags." Sharpe listened to the sound of laughter. "It wasn't like this," he said. A dozen children, all in grey dresses or breeches, were playing a complicated game of tag about the flagpole. 3 crippled children and 1 idiot, a girl with her head cocked sideways, who twitched and dribbled and made small mewing noises, watched from wicker chairs equipped with wheels. "They seem happy," Sharpe said.
That is important, Astrid said. A happy child is more likely to be given a home by a good family.
She led him upstairs to where the hospital occupied 2 large rooms, and Sharpe waited on the balcony while she delivered her food, and he thought of Jem Hocking and Brewhouse Lane. He remembered Hocking's fear and smiled. "Why are you smiling?" Astrid asked as she came back to the balcony. "I was remembering being a child," he lied. "So it was happy?" "No, they beat us too much."
"These children are beaten," Astrid said, "if they steal or tell lies. But it is not frequent."
"They used to whip us," Sharpe said, "till the blood ran." Astrid frowned as if she was not sure whether to believe him.
"My mother always said the English were cruel."
"World's cruel," Sharpe said.
"Then we must try to be kind," Astrid said firmly.
He walked her home. Bang scowled when they came through the door, and Ollie Skovgaard, seeing his daughter's happiness, gave Sharpe a suspicious look. "We must find Danes to protect us," Skovgaard told his daughter that evening. But men were needed in the militia, and the militia was busy throwing up the new outworks in the suburbs, and so, reluctantly, and mostly at his daughter's urging, Skovgaard allowed Sharpe to stay on in Ulfhedsplatz. On Sunday, the rifleman went with the household to church, where the hymns droned. The sermon was interminable, and Sharpe fell asleep until Axel Bang dug an indignant elbow in his ribs. Next morning, Sharpe escorted Skovgaard to a bank, and in the afternoon he accompanied Astrid back to the orphanage, and then to a sugar warehouse on Amager, the small island on which the eastern half of Copenhagen was built. They crossed a lifting bridge which spanned the narrowest part of the harbour and walked past the vast boom which protected the inner haven in which the endangered Danish fleet was stored. Sharpe counted 18 ships of the line and as many frigates, brigs and gunboats. 2 great ships were under construction in the yard, their great hulls rearing on the slipways like half-clothed skeletons of wood. These ships were Napoleon's last hope of invading Britain, which was why the British were in Denmark and the French were poised across the Holstein frontier. Sailors were busy taking the great guns from the ships of the line and ferrying them ashore, where they would be added to the artillery already on the city's walls. After Astrid had delivered a bill of sale to the sugar warehouse, she led him to the seaward ramparts, where they climbed to the fire step between 2 giant bastions. The wind ruffled the water and lifted the fair hair at Astrid's neck as she gazed northwards to where the masts of the British fleet looked like a thicket on the horizon.
"Why are they staying to the north?"
"Takes time to land an army," Sharpe said. "Lots of time. It'll be a day or 2 before they come here." The dull boom of a gun sounded flat in the warm afternoon. Sharpe stared eastwards and saw a smudge of grey-white smoke rise from the distant sea. The smoke drifted on the wind to reveal the low hull of a gunboat. Then a second gunboat fired to make a new white cloud. The gunboats were strung across the wide channel that ran past the city, and a ship had sailed into their clutches. A third gunboat fired, then a cluster of shots hammered like thunder across the sun-touched waves. Sharpe took the telescope from his pocket, extended the tubes, and saw the trapped ship's sails shudder as her captain turned into the wind. Then her flag, a British ensign, came down from the mizzen.
"What is it?"
Astrid asked. A British merchantman, Sharpe said. The skipper must have come from deep in the Baltic, and probably had no idea that his country was at war with Denmark until the gunships had pounced. The Danish boats, low in the water, had ceased firing as the British ship furled her sails. He gave the telescope to Astrid, who steadied it on the wall. "What happens now?" she asked. "They bring it in. She's a prize." "So we are at war?" She sounded incredulous. The British army might have landed. The city might be raising a militia and building forts, yet still war had been unimaginable to her. Not in Denmark, and certainly not against Britain. "We're at war," Sharpe said. On their way back to Ulfedsplatz, they made a detour to see the big houses in Bredgard. It was easy enough to spot which house belonged to Lavissa's grandfather, for a small crowd was waiting outside for a glimpse of their new hero. Women carried flowers, and someone had hung a Danish flag from the lantern above the front door. Sharpe stood on the street's far side and gazed up at the windows, but there was no sign of the renegade. Lavissa had effectively vanished, as though the night at Skovgard's house had never happened. Yet Lavissa and his French allies would be back. Sharpe was sure of it. Next day, the city was filled with the news that the British were at last marching south. It was that same day that Sharpe came back from the orphanage to discover Axel Bang was now in uniform. He wore a plain blue coat with tarnished silver buttons and a single silver bar on each shoulder. "I am a lieutenant in the militia," Bang said proudly. He carried an ancient sword with a black cloth-covered scabbard. A half-dozen men, all with muskets, lounged in the warehouse shadows. They were elderly men, the remnants of Skovgard's workforce, who had all joined the militia with Bang. "They are stationed here," Bang said, "because this is now an official food store for the city. We are on guard, and now that we have muskets we can provide protection for Mr. Skovgard." Sharpe looked at the 6 men. "Properly trained, are they?" "We shall give a good account of ourselves," Bang said confidently. "There is something else, Mr. Sharpe." "Go on." "You are English, yes?" "Go on." Bang shrugged. "You are an enemy. Out of loyalty to Mr. Skovgard, I have done nothing about it. But it cannot continue. I shall have to arrest you." "Now?" Sharpe smiled. "If you do not leave the city, yes. I am an officer now. I have responsibilities." "What you've got, Axel," Sharpe told him, "is an itch in your breeches." Yet Sharpe knew the man was right. He was surprised that no one had come to arrest him, for it was surely no secret that Skovgard had an Englishman in his house. Yet Copenhagen was so civilized, so ready to believe that no harm could come to it, that the authorities had tolerated him. Next morning, when Sharpe woke in the warehouse, he heard the distant crackle of musketry. It was very far off, but unmistakable. And an hour later, when he was washing under the pump in the backyard, he heard the percussive thump of big guns firing. So, the army had arrived at last. Ollie Skovgard, the swelling about his jaw much reduced, came into the yard and frowned at Sharpe. "I think you should leave us, Lieutenant." "You feel safe with Axel and his merry men?" "Safe from whom?" Skovgard looked up into the sky, where bands of white clouds stretched from east to west. "From my friends, the British?" he asked sarcastically. "From your new friends, the French." "I shall stay here in the warehouse, and so will Astrid. Axel and his men will be sufficient, I think." Skovgard listened to the distant gunfire for a few seconds. "Axel is an officer now," he went on, "and your presence is an embarrassment to him." "I wonder why," Sharpe said. thinking of Astrid. Skovgard must have known what Sharpe was thinking, for he blushed slightly. "Axel is a good Dane," he said hotly, "and you are an enemy, Mr. Sharpe." "Enemy?" Sharpe pulled on his shirt. "I spent the last 2 afternoons playing tip-cat with children in an orphanage. Is that what an enemy does?" Skovgard frowned. "You are English, and Axel is right. You put me in a difficult position. You may keep the 2 pistols, but I insist you leave. And if I don't—" For a moment Skovgard looked angry. Then he bowed his head as though he was thinking. "I have lost much in my life, Lieutenant." He spoke surprisingly softly, still looking at the ground. "My wife, my son-in-law, and my grandson. God has punished me. I have pursued worldly goals, Lieutenant." He looked up at Sharpe now, "preferring success to his will. Your country has rewarded me greatly in return for my help. That is how I could buy the house in Westerfeld. But it is the fruit of sin. I am sorry, Lieutenant, but to me you represent evil. Your country's desires, its actions, its ambitions, they are all wrong. You think the French—" "I think the French are as bad, if not worse," Skovgard anticipated Sharpe's words. "But it is my soul I must worry about. I shall put my faith in God, where it should have been all these months. This is a godly family, Lieutenant. It always has been, and you, I think, are not godly." "I see—" Skovgard hesitated and frowned, then nerved himself to go on. "I see my daughter's interest in you. That does not surprise me, for you resemble Niels, but you cannot be good for her." Sharpe tried to speak. "No," Skovgard again interrupted. "Tell me, Lieutenant, are you saved in Jesus Christ?" Sharpe stared at Stovgard's thin face, then sighed. "No." "Then you will leave us, for this is a godly house, and your presence disturbs us." "You think God will protect you from Lavisse?" "He can do whatever he wishes, Lieutenant. He will hold us against all the world's evils, if it is his will." "Then you'd better pray, Mr. Skovgard. You'd better bloody pray." There was nothing to be done. Sharpe changed into his uniform, which he covered with his greatcoat. He put the telescope into one pocket, the guineas into another, belted the sabre about his waist, and thrust the good pistols into the belt, then went down to the kitchen, where Astrid had just served Axel Bang with a dish of barley porridge. "So, you leave us, I hear," Bang said happily. "Isn't that what you wanted, Axel?" "We can manage without the English," Bang said cheerfully. "You will have breakfast, Lieutenant?" Astrid asked Sharpe. "I just came to say goodbye." "I shall come to the gate with you." She took off her apron, and ignoring Bang, who watched her like a dog eyeing a bone, led Sharpe into the yard. Sharpe had thought she meant she would see him to the warehouse's back gate, which opened onto Skindergarde. But she must have meant one of the city gates, for she walked into the street with him. "You shouldn't be out here on your own," Sharpe told her. For once she had said goodbye, she would have to return to her father's house unescorted. "No one is looking for me this morning," she said dismissively. "Everyone is watching the British." She led him past the cathedral, which lay close to the warehouse. "I am sorry you are going." "So am I." "And the children will miss their American friend." She smiled. "You like children?" "So long as they're properly cooked. Can't bear them cold." "You are a horrible man, Lieutenant." "Richard." "You are a horrible man, Richard." She put her arm into his elbow. "How will you get through the city gates?" "I'll find a way." They stopped close to the Nora gate. The ramparts above the tunnel were crowded with folk staring westwards. Musketry still crackled in the city suburbs, and every now and then a bigger gun hammered. A constant stream of militiamen was going through the gate, and Sharpe reckoned he would lose himself among that crowd. Yet he did not want to go. He looked down at Astrid. "Be careful," he told her. "We are a careful nation," she said with a smile. "When it is over—" She stopped. "I shall come and look for you." She nodded. "I'd like that." She held out a hand. "I am sorry it is like this. My father, he has not been happy since Mother died. And Axel—" She shrugged as if she could find no explanation for Bang. Sharpe ignored her hand. He leaned forward and kissed her cheek instead. "I'll see you soon." She nodded again, then abruptly turned and hurried away. Sharpe stared after her, and to anyone watching it must have just seemed like another man saying farewell to his woman. She turned when she was 20 paces away and saw him gazing at her, and he knew she did not want him to go. But what choice was there? He walked to the gate where his weapons made him look like any other militiaman. He turned a last time to look for Astrid, but she was gone. The crowd jostled him on, and he emerged from the gate's tunnel to see a dirty cloud above the roofs and trees of the western suburbs. It was powder smoke. He stopped outside and stared back through the tunnel, hoping for one last glimpse of Astrid. He was confused. He was in love with a woman he did not know, except he knew her loyalty was to the enemy. Yet Denmark did not feel like an enemy, though it was. And he was a soldier still, and soldiers, he reckoned, fought for those who could not fight for themselves. And that meant he should be fighting for Astrid's folk and not his own. But that was too great a wrench to contemplate. So he was simply confused. A sergeant grabbed Sharpe's elbow and shoved him towards a growing band of men who were being hurriedly assembled close to the moat-like lake. Sharpe let himself be pushed. An officer was standing on a low wall and haranguing around 300 men, most of them confused militiamen, though there was a corps of sailors armed with heavy sea service muskets. Sharpe did not understand a word, but from the officer's tone and from the man's gestures he gathered that the British were threatening some place to the southwest, and this makeshift half-battalion was being asked to throw the invaders out. A roar of approval rewarded whatever the officer had said. Then the whole group, Sharpe among them, streamed across the causeway. Sharpe made no effort to leave the group. He had no choice but to rejoin the British Army, and every step took him closer. The officer led them across the moat, past a cemetery, a church, a hospital, and then through streets of new houses. The sound of musketry grew louder. Bigger guns hammered to the north, clouding the sky with powder smoke. The officer stopped beside a high brick wall and waited as his ragtag followers gathered around him. Then he spoke urgently, and whatever he said must have roused the men, for they gave a growl of agreement. A man turned to Sharpe and asked him a question. "American," Sharpe said. "You're American?" "Sailor." "You are welcome, I think. You know what the captain said?" "No." "The English are in the garden." The man nodded towards the wall. "But there are not many of them, and we shall throw them out. We are making a new battery here. You have fought before, perhaps?" "Yes," Sharpe said. "Then I shall stay with you." The man smiled. "I am Jens." "Richard." Sharpe introduced himself. He took out one of the pistols and pretended to check its priming. The weapon was unloaded, and he had no intention of charging it. "What do you do?" he asked Jens, who was a pleasant-faced, fair-haired young man with a snub nose and lively eyes. Jens flourished his ancient musket. The lock was rusted, the stock was split, and one of its barrel hoops was missing. "I kill Englishmen." "And when you're not killing them?" Sharpe asked.
"I am, what is it called? I make ships."
"A shipwright."
"A shipwright," Jens agreed. "We work on a new warship, but we have left her unfinished. We do this first."
The captain peered through the gate, then gestured that his men should follow him. They jostled through the gate, and Sharpe found himself in a wide, park-like garden. Gravel paths led to groves of trees, and an elegant white summer-house, a confection of gables, verandas, and pinnacles, stood on a small hillock. The garden looked to be a more genteel version of the Vauxhall Gardens in London. A company of regular Danish soldiers was crouching by the summer-house, but there was no musketry sounding nearby, and no sign of any British soldiers. The militia captain, unsure what to do, ran to consult the regular officer, and his men sat on the grass. Far off to the north, smoke trails whipped across the sky. Shells, Sharpe assumed. A dull explosion sounded in the distance.
"Even if they take these places," Jens said, waving his hand to show he meant the suburbs, "they will never get into the city."
"What if they bombard it?" Sharpe asked.
Jens frowned. "You mean with guns?"
He seemed shocked.
"They will not do that. There are women in the city."
The militia captain came back, followed by 2 men on horseback, one a cavalry officer and the other a civilian. Sharpe stood with the others, then saw that the horsemen were Barker and Lavisser. The 2 men were only a few feet away, and Sharpe turned his back as Lavisser began haranguing the civilian soldiers.
"We are to go forward," Jens translated for Sharpe.
Lavisser, his sword drawn, had taken his place at the head of the militia, while Barker was behind them. Sharpe pulled his brown hat down over his eyes and wished he had loaded the pistol. It was too late now, for the militia was hurrying west towards the trees. They went in a bunch, and if the British had cannon, there would be a massacre.
"We are to attack their side," Jens said.
"Their flank?"
"I expect so. When it is over you can take an English gun, eh? Better than that little pistol."
Lavisser led them into the woodland. A twisting path went downhill, and Lavisser, evidently confident that no British troops were close by, spurred his horse ahead. There was plainly a battle of sorts going on just to the north, for the musketry was crackling in loud bursts, but nothing was happening in this part of the gardens, where the militia, confident that they were hooking around the southern flank of the British, followed Lavisser down into a gentle valley, where a small stream fed an ornamental pond. Lavisser shouted at the militia, evidently ordering them into ranks. The group of sailors, all in straw hats and pigtails, set an example by forming 4 ranks, and the 2 sergeants pushed the rest into crude files. Lavisser, his horse pouring great gouts from the turf, shouted excitedly.
"He says the enemy is not many," Jens translated.
"How does he know?" Sharpe wondered aloud.
"Because he is a proper officer, of course," Jens said.
Lavisser had not looked in Sharpe's direction, and Barker was still trailing the 300 men who now set off up the western slope, where their cohesion was immediately broken by the trees. The sound of musketry was coming from Sharpe's right, but it was sporadic now. Perhaps this makeshift half-battalion of disorganized enthusiasts really could take the approaching British on the flank. But Sharpe was relieved that he was in the rear rank, and at the left-hand side, farthest from both Lavisser and the sound of battle. He was trying to load the pistol as he walked, and wondering if he could somehow seize Lavisser and carry him bodily into the British lines. Then a musket shot sounded directly ahead. The Danes were among the trees still, but there was open ground 100 paces in front of them. Sharpe saw a drift of musket smoke at the edge of that sunlit space. Then more muskets sounded. Lavisser dug in his spurs, and the unwieldy mass began to run. Sharpe ran wide to the left. He could see redcoats now, but only a handful. He guessed there was a British skirmish line at the edge of the wood, and that meant a full battalion was not far away. The Danes were shouting excitedly. Then Sharpe saw a redcoat clearly, and saw the man's wing epaulets. A light company, then. So the other 9 companies were close at hand, formed and ready to fire. The Danes, knowing nothing of what waited for them, only saw the British skirmishers retreating, and mistook that for victory. Lavisser must have thought the same, for he was yelping as though he was on a hunting field, and holding his sabre ready to strike down a fugitive. The Redcoat Light Company fired and retreated. One man knelt, aimed and fired, while his companion reloaded. Then the man who had fired ran back a few paces to let his comrade cover him while reloading. A Dane was sprawling on the ground, twitching. Another was leaning against a tree and staring at the blood pouring from a wound in his thigh. Others of the Danes fired their muskets as they ran, the balls going wild and high in the trees. A whistle sounded ahead, calling the skirmishers back to the British battalion's other 9 companies. Lavisser must have seen those companies, for he turned his horse so hard that its eyes went white and its hooves scrabbled in the leaf mould. He frantically shouted for his men to halt at the wood's edge and level their muskets. Then the British volley came. The battalion had waited till the Danes were at the edge of the trees, and then 9 companies let fly. The balls splintered bark, ripped through leaves, thumped men down and hammered on musket stocks. Lavisser himself was miraculously untouched. "Fire!" he shouted in English, forgetting himself. "Fire!" Most of the Danes ignored him. They still thought they were winning, and so they ran farther into the open ground, only to find there was a red line of men behind a ditch some 50 yards ahead. That line was reloading. Ramrods turned in the air and came scraping down. There were flickers of tiny flames in the grass where the British musket wadding had set fires. A red-jacketed officer, cocked hat low over his eyes, was riding straight-backed behind the line. Sharpe watched the muskets come up into the redcoats' shoulders. The militia was at last realising its predicament, and those who still had loaded muskets aimed at the British. Others kept running, then saw they were isolated, and so hesitated. Lavisser's charge was already in chaos, and the British had yet to loose their second volley. "Platoon! Fire!" Sharpe heard the British order clearly, and he grabbed Jens by the shoulder and dragged him down to the ground. "What?" Jens protested. "Down," Sharpe snarled. Then the first platoon fired, and the next followed immediately. The noise was deafening as the dirty grey smoke rolled down the battalion's front, and the balls whacked into the disorganised militia. Sharpe pressed his face into the grass and listened to the volleys. One after the other, each spitting about 50 bullets at the bewildered Danes. It was the first time Sharpe had been on the receiving end of British musketry, and he flinched under it. Jens fired his musket, but his eyes were closed, and his ball must have gone 10 feet above the redcoat shakos. Jens knelt to reload, but just then another regiment of British appeared from some trees on the right, and they let loose a battalion volley that sounded like the splintering of Hell's gates. One of the balls snatched the musket from Jens' hands, shattering the stock. Then the new battalion settled into the machine-like platoon fire, and the Danes could only cower under the twin flails. Sharpe scrambled backwards, staying low, getting out of the tangling fire of the 2 battalions. He looked for Barker, but the man had vanished, though Lavisser was visible enough. The renegade was galloping his horse up and down behind the ragged militia, shouting at them to close ranks and fire back at the British. He fired both his own pistols at the cloud of smoke shrouding the nearest redcoat battalion. Then Sharpe saw Lavisser's horse lurch and slew sideways as a bullet struck deep into its rump. The beast tried to stay on all fours, but more bullets flecked its glossy coat red, and it sank onto its haunches as Lavisser kicked his feet free of the stirrups. Another bullet twitched the horse's head sideways in a spray of blood. Lavisser managed to throw himself clear of the dying beast, then dropped to the grass as a flight of bullets hissed overhead. Sharpe still slithered back, found himself in a small dip, and so ran for the trees. He would take cover, wait for the fight to end, then join the redcoats. Jens had followed Sharpe. The shipwright looked dazed. He flinched at the sound of each volley. "What happened?" he asked. "They're real soldiers," Sharpe answered sourly. He saw the Danish sailors try to organise a rank that could return the British fire, but the 2nd British Battalion had marched 10 paces forward and poured their platoon fire into the sailors' flank, and the seamen crouched as though they sheltered in a storm. One man fired back, but he had left his ramrod in the barrel, and Sharpe saw it cartwheeling across the grass. A wounded man crawled back, trailing a shattered leg. 2 battalions of red-coated regulars were giving an undisciplined group of amateurs a ruthless lesson in soldiering. They made it look easy, but Sharpe knew how many hours of practice it had taken to make them so efficient. Then Jens shoved Sharpe sideways. "What the hell?" Sharpe began, when a pistol fired close by, and the bullet smacked into a tree beside Sharpe, who turned and saw it was Barker, behind him and on horseback. Sharpe levelled his own pistol, pulled the trigger, and the weapon did not fire. He had still not primed it. He threw the gun down, whipped the sabre from his scabbard, and ran at Barker, who turned his horse and spurred down the hill. The big man ducked beneath tree branches, then suddenly sawed on the reins to turn the horse back, and Sharpe saw he had a second pistol. He twisted sideways, expecting a shot, but Barker held his fire. Sharpe crouched in some bushes. He sheathed the sabre and pulled out his own second pistol. It would take time to reload, because the powder horn with its dispensary was a fiddly thing, but he started anyway. Barker was not far away. Sharpe risked a quick glance and saw only the riderless horse, so Barker was stalking him on foot. Move, he told himself, move now, because Barker knew where he was, and so he thrust the powder horn into a pocket and sprinted across a clearing, dodged into trees, jumped down a steep slope, and went to ground again behind a stand of laurel. He heard Barker's footsteps above him, but he reckoned he had bought himself enough time to load the pistol. British volleys stunned the sky above him. Some shots, missing the Danes, whipped through the trees at the top of the slope. Sharpe poured powder into the pistol, spat the bullet after, then heard the crashing feet, and looked up to see Barker charging headlong down the slope. The huge man had spotted Sharpe in the laurels and wanted the confrontation over. Sharpe's pistol was still unprimed, but Barker could not know that, so Sharpe stood, aimed the weapon and smiled. Barker took the bait, raising his own gun and firing too quickly. The ball whistled past Sharpe, who tucked the pistol under his left arm as he opened the small slide that would let a trickle of powder into the horn's dispensary. Barker saw what he was doing and drew a sword, and Sharpe, knowing he did not have time to prime the gun, let both pistol and powder horn drop. He drew his sabre. "Reckon you can beat me with a blade, Barker?" Barker whipped his sword back and forth. It was a slim weapon, one of Lavisser's old swords, and Barker looked disgusted at the steel's flexibility. He could use guns. He liked knives and was lethal with a cudgel, but the sword seemed flimsy to him.
I could never use the bloody things, he said.
Sharpe just stared at the big man, wondering if he had heard right. Barker slashed the blade at the laurels, then frowned at Sharpe.
You been in the city all along?
Yes.
He thought you'd left.
He didn't look very hard, Sharpe said, because I wasn't tied in.
He's been busy, Barker said, and now you're going back to the army?
Yes.
Then bugger off,
Barker said, jerking his head up the hill. Sharpe, astonished, let his sabre tip drop. Come with me. Barker looked offended at the invitation.
I ain't buggering off.
Then why aren't you killing me? Barker gave a sneering look at the sword.
Not with this, he said. I ain't any good with bloody swords. Never learned them, see? So you end up skewering me, don't you? Not much sense there, but I ain't frightened,
Barker added earnestly.
Don't you think I'm frightened? If I sees you back in the city, I'll do you. But I'm not a bleeding gentleman. I only fights when I knows I can win.
He stepped back and jerked his head uphill again.
So bugger off, Lieutenant.
Sharpe backed away, readying to accept the unexpected invitation. But just then a voice hailed Barker from high among the trees. It was Lavisa. Barker shot a warning look at Sharpe. Then the voice called again.
Barker! Down here, sir, Barker shouted, then looked at Sharpe. He'll have a gun, Lieutenant.
Sharpe stayed. He had seen Lavisa fire both his pistols, and he doubted that either would be reloaded. There was a chance, he thought, a very small chance, that he could hold Lavisa here until the redcoats came. The redcoats had to come soon, for up on the hilltop the Danes were dying. Only the sailors had the discipline to reload, but they also had the sense to retreat. They grabbed their wounded and dragged them back to the woods, and one by one the remaining militiamen tried to follow them. The platoon, firing, punched the eardrums as smoke drifted thick and foul across the blooded grass where the tiny fires burned. One of the two Danish sergeants tried to rouse the cowering men, but he was hit in the throat. He did a pirouette, feet tangling, as blood jetted from his gullet. He continued to turn as he sank down. Then he crumpled and his musket slid along the grass. Bullets were thumping into corpses, twitching them.
"Hold your fire!"
a voice called.
"Cease fire! Charge bayonets! Skirmishers! Forward!"
Lavisa had found Barker's discarded horse and rode it down the hill to see his servant facing Sharpe. The renegade looked surprised, then smiled.
"What on earth are you doing here, Richard?"
He sounded oddly cheerful.
"Came to get you."
Lavisa glanced up the hill. The remnants of his force were running, and the British must have been approaching the trees, but he sounded quite unworried.
"Bloody militia! Redcoats are good, though.
How are you, Richard?"
"Taking up dentistry, have you?" Sharpe sneered. "Failed as a bloody soldier, so you draw teeth now."
"Oh, Richard!" Lavisa sounded disappointed. "You should leave attempts at wit to the witty." Sharpe raised the sabre as Barker stirred, but the big man was just moving to stand between Sharpe and Lavisa.
"You're not fighting for Denmark," Sharpe said to Lavisa, "but for the frogs."
"Comes to the same thing, Richard," Lavisa said cheerfully. He drew a pistol, then pulled a cartridge from a pouch. "Denmark is a little country," Lavisa explained when he had pulled the cartridge open with his teeth, "and she was always going to be raped by either Britain or France. Britain has got her pleasure in first, but all she'll do is drive Denmark into France's arms, and I really can't imagine that the Emperor would want to leave dim Frederick as crown prince. No, He'll be looking for some splendid and vigorous young man to be his ruler here. He poured powder into the barrel. Barker took a step towards Sharpe, who slashed the sabre to drive the servant back. "It's all right, Barker," Lavisa said. "I shall take care of the lieutenant."
"I told him he could go," Barker said. "He's been in the city, sir, but he's leaving."
Lavisa raised his eyebrows. "You are generous, Barker." He looked at Sharpe. "I don't really want to kill you, Richard. I rather like you. Does that surprise you? I suppose that's not important, is it? What's important is that Mr. Skovgard is now unguarded. Is that a safe assumption?"
"Assume what you like," Sharpe said.
"How very obliging of you, Richard." Lavisa rammed the bullet home, then paused and looked reflective. "A nauseatingly dull man, our Ollie. He's the kind of fellow I really dislike. He's so upright, so hard-working, so bloody pious. He's an affront to me." He lifted the frizzen to prime the gun. "Pretty daughter, though." Sharpe used the efficacious word. Lavisa laughed. Then a shout up the hill made him turn. A skirmish line had appeared among the trees. Sharpe had been expecting it. "Down here!" he shouted. "Down here! Quick!" A musket fire and the ball tore leaves to shreds above Lavisa. Men were coming fast and quick, and Lavisa did not finish priming the pistol, but just turned the horse. "Au revoir, Richard," he called. The two men fled. Sharpe started to follow. Then a dozen shots riddled the laurels, and he crouched instead. Barker and Lavisa vanished. Sharpe took off his greatcoat and rescued his discarded pistol. A group of redcoats came down the slope. Their coats had blue facings, Welsh fusiliers, and their muskets were tipped with bayonets that pointed towards Sharpe. Then a sergeant saw Sharpe's uniform and pushed the nearest gun down. He was a short man, his broad face incredulous as he stared at the green jacket.
"I'm not drunk, Carrie, am I?" he asked a private. "No more than ever, Sergeant. Looks like a rifleman."
Sharpe sheathed his sabre.
"Morning, Sergeant." "Sir!"
The Welshman gave a twitch that was a gesture towards standing to attention.
"If you don't mind my bloody asking, sir, what are the bloody rifles doing here?"
"Got lost, Sergeant." A captain came down the slope with a group of men who held Jens prisoner.
"What the devil's happening, Sergeant Davis?" "Got a lost rifleman, sir," the sergeant said.
"Lieutenant Sharpe," Sharpe said. "Reporting for duty, sir. You wouldn't know where Sir David Baird is, would you?"
"Sir David?"
"He's expecting me," Sharpe lied. "And that fellow's with me." He gestured at Jens. "We've been making a reconnaissance in the city. Nice morning, isn't it?" He began climbing the hill, and the captain followed him.
"You been in the city?"
"It's a good place," Sharpe said, "but with very fat churches. You'd best pray God isn't tempted to take sides, Captain, because there are a terrible number of Danes battering his eardrums." He grinned at Jens. "Are you all right?"
"Yes."
Jens, not surprisingly, looked bewildered.
"You were with the Danes?" the captain asked.
"They were only militia," Sharpe said, "but there was a company of proper troops on the next hill. No artillery, though." He emerged onto the hilltop, which was horrid with bodies. Welsh bandsmen tended the Danish wounded, while a few miserable prisoners stood among the thinning smoke. "Would you know where Sir David is?" Sharpe asked the captain.
"He's at brigade, I think, over there."
He pointed beyond the ditch.
"Last I saw of him, he was by some glass houses."
"Are you coming, Jens?" Sharpe asked. And he sounded a lot more cheerful than he felt, for it was time to face the music, and time to confess that he had failed. Chapter 7. Sharpe walked Jens away from the carnage. Once beyond the ditch and out of sight of the 2 redcoat battalions, Sharpe pointed back towards the city. "Get into that lower ground." He showed Jens how to sneak round the side of the Fusiliers, "and then just keep walking." Jens frowned. "You are not American?" "I'm not." Jens seemed reluctant to go. "Did you know what would happen back there?" "No, but it wasn't hard to guess, was it? They're real soldiers, lad, trained to it." Sharpe took the remaining pistol from his belt. "You know Ulfedsplatz?" "Of course." "There's a man called Skovgard there. Give this gun to him. Now hurry, before the British capture the rest of the gardens. Keep in those lower trees and then go straight to the gate, understand?" "You're English?" "I'm English." Sharpe pushed the unprimed gun into Jens's hand. "And thank you for saving my life. Now go on, hurry." Jens gave Sharpe a bewildered glance, then ran. Sharpe watched until the Dane was safely hidden among the trees, then slung his greatcoat over his shoulder and walked on. Failed, he thought. Failed utterly. He climbed a low hill. The newly dug ditch where the Fusiliers had fired their volleys had evidently been the beginning of a new Danish outwork that had been captured before they could throw up walls or mount guns, and now red-coated engineers were standing on the hill's summit from where they trained telescopes on the city walls. They were obviously considering the hill as a place for a battery. The sea could be seen to the south, while on the hill's northern side, in a gully, a gardener was carefully carrying plants into a greenhouse. Beyond the gully, the land rose to a low ridge, where a group of mounted British officers watched another battalion advance into the woodlands. Thick smoke smeared the eastern air. The Danes, retreating from the suburbs closer to the city, had set some houses on fire, presumably so that the British could not use them as advance positions. Farther north, out of sight, there was some heavy artillery at work, for the air was being punched by the percussive blasts, and the sky was streaked and silting with smoke. Major General Sir David Baird had a musket wound on his left hand, and another rivulet of blood where a ball had grazed his neck, but he was feeling ebullient. He had led a brigade into the gardens, ejected some Danish regulars, massacred some brave idiots from the militia, and now watched as his men secured the southern ground that would finally isolate Copenhagen from the rest of Zealand. Captain Gordon, his aide and nephew, had been wasting his breath by chiding the general for exposing himself to unnecessary danger, but Baird was enjoying himself. He would have liked to keep the advance going, right through the western suburbs, across the lakes, and into the city itself. "We could have the fleet by nightfall," he claimed. Lord Pumphrey, the civilian aide from the Foreign Office, looked alarmed at the general's bellicosity, but Captain Gordon did his best to restrain Sir David. "I doubt Lord Cathcart would want a premature assault, sir," the aide observed. "That's because Cathcart's a bloody old woman," Baird grumbled. Cathcart was the general in command of the army. "A bloody old woman," Baird said again, then frowned at Lord Pumphrey, who was trying to draw his attention. "What is it?" he growled, then saw where his lordship was pointing. A rifle officer was coming up the path from the greenhouse. "It's Lieutenant Sharpe, Sir David," Pumphrey said. "Good God!" Baird stared at Sharpe. "Good God! Gordon, deal with him." The general, not wanting to be associated with failure, spurred his horse farther along the ridge. Gordon dismounted and, accompanied by Lord Pumphrey, walked to meet Sharpe. "So you escaped the city," Gordon greeted him. "I'm here, sir," Sharpe said. Gordon heard the bitterness. He led Sharpe towards the back of the greenhouse, where the General's orderly had a fire going and a kettle boiling. "We heard about Lavisser," he said gently. "We read the Berlingske Tidende." "He implied you were an assassin," Lord Pumphrey said with a shudder. "So very distressing for you. We sent a letter to His Royal Highness denying the allegation. Of course we did." "It's all very distressing," Gordon said. "And I'm very sorry you became involved, Sharpe. But how were we to know?" "You don't know any of it," Sharpe said angrily. "We don't?" Gordon asked mildly. He paused to organise some cups of tea. "What we learnt the day after you left England, Lieutenant," Gordon turned back to Sharpe, "is that Captain Lavisser, as well as being in debt, faced a prosecution for breach of promise. A woman, of course. She claims the marriage date was settled. One suspects she is also pregnant. He was doubtless eager to flee the country, but was rather clever to persuade the Treasury to fund his escape." "The Foreign Office advised against it," Lord Pumphrey put in. "As you will doubtless remind us frequently," Gordon said. He shrugged. "I'm sorry, Sharpe. Had we known, we should never have let him go." "There's worse," Sharpe said. "Ah, the tea," Gordon said. "Nature's soft nurse. No, that's sleep, isn't it? But tea's the next best thing." "Thank you, Boswell." Gordon took a tin mug from the General's orderly and handed it to Sharpe. Lord Pumphrey ignored the offered tea. His lordship no longer sported a beauty spot, and he had abandoned his white lace jacket in favour of a simple brown coat, but he still seemed out of place. He took a pinch of snuff, then shuddered as a Danish prisoner came down the hill. The man was bleeding from a scalp wound, and 2 Fusiliers were trying to hold him still while they bandaged his head, but the man kept shaking himself free and staggering a few wild steps. "Tell me what we don't know," Lord Pumphrey said, turning his back on the wounded man. So Sharpe told them how Barker had tried to kill him, how he had then gone to Skovgard, who had betrayed him to Lavisser, about the French and the battle in the house that did not lie so very far to the north. He told them about Madame Viseur and the 3 dead men and Skovgard's bloody gums and the teeth lying on the desk. "Lavisser is working with the French," Sharpe said. "He's a goddamn traitor." Lord Pumphrey took the news surprisingly calmly. He said nothing for a while, but just listened to the heavy sound of artillery to the north. "Gunboats," he said bleakly. "I am forever astonished by the military. Their budgets are raised each year, yet the weapons are never suitable. It turns out that the Danish gunboats are rather better than ours. They draw less water and carry heavier ordnance, and the results are not at all pretty." He watched as the Fusiliers at last wrestled the wounded Dane to the ground. Then he walked a few delicate steps northwards to escape the man's moaning. "So Captain Lavisser is still in the city?" he asked Sharpe. "He was here in these gardens a minute ago," Sharpe said bitterly. "The bastard was telling me that Bonaparte will want a new ruler for Denmark, someone like him. But the last I saw of the bastard, he was running like a deer." "Of course we shall deny that any of this happened," Gordon said. "Deny it?" Sharpe spoke too loudly. "My dear Sharpe," Gordon remonstrated, "we cannot possibly have it known that the Duke of York had an aide who was on the French payroll. It would be a disastrous revelation." "Calamitous," Lord Pumphrey agreed. "So I trust we can depend on your discretion?" Gordon asked. Sharpe sipped the tea and watched the smoke trails in the northern sky. They were too thick to be the fuses of shells, so he decided they had to be rockets. He'd not seen any rockets since India. "If I'm still a rifle officer," he said, "then I'll be discreet." You can order me to be discreet." It was an attempt at blackmail. Sharpe had abandoned his place at the Shorncliffe barracks, and he could expect little mercy from Colonel Beckwith unless Sir David Baird spoke for him. But Baird had only promised him support if he succeeded in Copenhagen. And he had failed. But it was clear no one wanted that failure known.
"Of course you're still a rifle officer," Gordon said forcefully, "and Sir David will be happy to explain the circumstances to your colonel."
"So long, of course, as you'll keep quiet," Pumphrey said.
"I'll keep silent," Sharpe promised.
"But tell me about Skovgard," Lord Pumphrey said. "You think he's in danger?"
"Bloody hell, yes, my lord," Sharpe said vigorously. "But he wouldn't let me stay, because he's not happy with Britain at the moment. He's got half a dozen old men with even older muskets guarding him, but they won't last 2 minutes against Lavisser and Barker."
"I do hope you're wrong," Lord Pumphrey said quietly.
"I wanted to stay," Sharpe said, "but he wouldn't let me. Said he'd trust in God." "But your part's over now," Gordon declared. "Lavisser's a renegade. The gold is gone, and we've been thoroughly humbugged. But it's not your fault, Sharpe, not your fault at all. You behaved creditably, and I shall so inform your colonel. You know your regiment's here."
"I guessed as much, sir."
"They're down south, near a place called Koga, I think. You'd best take yourself off there."
"And what of Lavisser?" Sharpe asked.
"I suspect we shall never see him again," Gordon said bleakly. "Oh, we'll capture the city, but I've no doubt the Honourable John will conceal himself from us, and we're hardly likely to search every attic and cellar for him, and I suspect His Majesty's Treasury can afford the loss of 43,000 guineas, don't you?"
"Is there much food in the city?"
"Food?"
Sharpe was momentarily thrown by the change of subject.
"Well stocked up on victuals, are they?" "Yes, sir. Carts and ships were arriving all the time I was there, packed with grain."
"Tragic," Gordon murmured. Sharpe frowned when he realized why Gordon had asked the question. If the city had plenty of food, then it could hold out against a prolonged blockade. But there was an alternative to blockade, or, indeed, siege, and Sharpe shuddered.
"You can't bombard the place, sir."
"No." It was Lord Pumphrey who made the inquiry. "And why not?"
"Women and children, my lord."
Lord Pumphrey sighed. "Women, children, and ships, Sharpe. Pray, do not forget the ships. That is why we are here." Gordon smiled.
"The good news, Sharpe, is that we've found the underground pipes that carry fresh water to the city, so we cut them. Maybe thirst will force a surrender, but we can't wait too long. The weather in the Baltic will have our fleet running for home before too many weeks. Fragile things, ships." He took a notebook from his pocket, tore out a page and scribbled some words. "There, Sharpe, your pass. If you walk north, you'll find a large red brick house that passes as our headquarters. Someone will know if there's a unit going south, and they'll make sure you go with them. I do apologize profoundly for having involved you in this nonsense. And remember, do, that none of this ever happened, eh?" He tossed away the dregs of his tea. "It was a bad dream, Lieutenant," Pumphrey said. Then he and Gordon went back to Baird. "Seen him off?" Baird asked Gordon.
"I sent him back to his regiment, sir, and you're going to sign a letter of recommendation that I shall forward to his colonel?"
Baird frowned. "I am? Why?"
"Because no one will then associate you with a man who has turned out to be the Duke of York's aide and a French spy."
"Bloody hellfire," Baird said.
"Precisely," Lord Pumphrey said. Sharpe walked north, and Jens went east. But the young shipwright did not take Sharpe's advice. He should have kept walking towards the city, as Sharpe had advised him, but he could not resist going north through the trees to discover the source of some sporadic musketry. Some skirmishers of the king's German legion saw him. They were Jager hunters, equipped with rifles, and they saw the pistol in Jens' hand and put 3 bullets in his chest. Nothing was working well, but Copenhagen was surrounded, the Danish fleet was trapped, and Sharpe had survived. General Castenschiold had been ordered to harry the southern flank of the British forces blockading Copenhagen, and he was not a man to ignore such orders. He dreamt of glory and dreaded defeat, and his moods swung between optimism and a deep gloom. The core of his force was a handful of regular soldiers, but most of his 14,000 men were from the militia. A few of those were well trained and decently armed, but far more were new recruits, some still wearing their wooden clogs, and most carrying weapons that belonged in farmyards rather than on battlefields. They were country boys, or else from the small Danish towns of southern Zealand.
This ends Disc 6.